Hello, everybody, and welcome back here to the main stage for the final sessions of this year's conference. So delighted to have you all back with us. Hopefully, you have had the chance to maybe stretch your legs and get some refreshments, and are back here now for this the final session. So the session now is going to be focusing on delivering connectivity for maybe looking a bit further forward, so looking at delivering connectivity for beyond 5G and possibly even towards 6G. So we're delighted to have a excellent lineup of panelists here to kind of talk and to focus specifically on the key bands of connectivity in Europe. But before that, we are honoured to have with us two esteemed speakers from outside Europe who are going to be looking at delivering connectivity in the US and in Saudi Arabia. So without further ado, I would like to now pass over to our moderator for the presentations and also for the panel that will follow, to Rob Yates. Rob, welcome. It's great to have you here, and we're really looking forward to the session. So without further ado, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction. Great to be here again, and it should be a dynamite session. So we'll start with, and the theme being continuing on the theme of allocations and licensing in spectrum, 5G and 6G. The first speaker will talk about the US. The second one is going to talk about Saudi Arabia. And then we have a panel, as Dan mentioned, largely focused on Europe. So I guess let me introduce Ira first, and we'll bring him up on the stage. Ira is currently with a very important role in the Office of Engineering and Technology, the OET of the FCC, who oversees a lot of expertise and engineering advice on technical support and various things relating to spectrum policy in the US. And I guess with the theme of planning for delivering connectivity for 5G and beyond in the US, we kind of have some insight in that as of yesterday's release of the C-band auction. So Ira, I'm sure you'll tell us all about that. So let me pass that over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for having me here at the conference. Always enjoy this. And so I guess, on the subject of 5G and beyond and everything that folks have been talking about, I think, unfortunately, given the current situation and doing this remote, also kind of hammers home the need that we keep looking for spectrum and the connectivity options. Is I think most of us, as I am, are connected through Wi-Fi and then other wired connections all around, and complete reliance. So I think very important subject. And so with that, let me talk a little bit about what's been happening in the U.S. So next slide, please. As I think folks know, we have a new acting chairwoman who has recently taken over. She is heavily involved and has been a huge supporter of 5G and continuing to look. As you can see from some of her quotes, this is actually just from the other day. And she has got us moving full speed ahead on a whole bunch of different fronts. In order to make sure that the U.S. continues to progress, on spectrum and everything else that surrounds getting this ecosystem out there and connecting folks throughout the country. Next slide. So the thing that I think we have to remember is, we keep talking about spectrum, but it's not just spectrum. We really need kind of a holistic, all-encompassing approach that obviously begins with spectrum, but is also heavily relying on the technology, security. We're seeing more and more how much that's come to the forefront. And certainly you need the infrastructure to support the networks. And of course, without funding, nothing happens. So next slide. So with that, let me just start on the spectrum side. Some of this, has been already done over the last year and a half or so. The commission has auctioned off and licensed a large chunk of the millimeter wave spectrum. We had our auctions for 24 gigahertz, 28 gigahertz, the 37 gigahertz band, 39, 47. We've issued licenses, and we are seeing deployments among our carriers and folks who've won licenses. And there's service in many of our larger cities, and that's starting to come out to more and more areas. So we're real excited to see what happens here, as continue to build out, given the tremendous amount of spectrum and the data rates and some of the applications that I think folks are going to be able to put here. I'll also mention in the 37 gigahertz band, the lower section of that 600 megahertz, we actually set up for shared use rather than exclusive licensing. We do have some folks using that spectrum and providing some fixed connectivity in a host of cities and providing service there too. So we're looking at a whole bunch of different models that folks can use, both on the licensed exclusive as well as shared spectrum, in order to let folks figure out what business plans are going to work best for what it is they want to do. Next slide, please. Moving down to the mid-band spectrum, and of course, this is where all the action seems to be these days. Very heavy, highly important, as I think everybody globally is really focused on these bands, given we kind of have a nice sweet spot between capacity and mobility and range. So C-band is certainly front and center here in the U.S. Just yesterday, the auction winners were announced from the auction that just completed a few weeks ago. It was a tremendously successful auction. Over $81 billion in gross proceeds for a bunch of licenses across 280 megahertz of spectrum. So I think we're real excited to see what happens here. Going forward as the licenses get issued and the carriers start to build out. So, this was a real, I guess, everything seems to be unique. But this band certainly was interesting, as the existing satellite providers had actually, come to us with a proposal for freeing up some spectrum. And as the commission worked with them over some time, that got expanded from 100 megahertz all the way up to clearing 300 megahertz, with 280 of that usable for terrestrial mobile 5G type networks. It's a fairly complicated regime, but certainly doable in having several phases of transition. The first one to clear 100 megahertz in our most of our top larger cities and markets within the end of this year, and then clearing the rest of the spectrum by the end of 2023, as we are providing some funding, and all of our satellite providers took our offers on accelerated timelines in order to speed this transition up and get this spectrum out into the market as quickly as possible. And again, the auction results were announced just yesterday, and our big three carriers, nationwide carriers, Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T were the big winners. But we are seeing increasingly some of our cable providers and other mid-tier providers have won licenses and are looking at providing service also. So that should provide some real nice competition across the U.S. Next slide. Our CBRS band, 3550 to 3700. I think this has garnered a lot of interest over the last couple of years as we've moved forward on a fairly unique regime here with three-tiered sharing through a completely dynamic system through a database, our spectrum access system. We're seeing a lot of uptake here, a lot of use. We did the auction for this, just last summer for our protected access licenses, and we've got a lot of interest. We sold, I think, the vast majority, if not all, of the licenses, over 22,000 of seven blocks in every county within the U.S. So that is currently being built out, and the take rate seems to be fairly high. The folks I've spoken to seem to be very pleased with the service, and I think this is going to be a real interesting to see how how this continues to grow and how the databases continue to evolve and provide provide for the needs of folks in this band, which certainly can be used to look at as a potential way of clearing spectrum in other bands as needed. But that'll have to be looked at down the road. Continuing on, if I can have the next slide, please. The 2.5 gigahertz band, very important band here. We have moved forward on several fronts on this particular band. There's 190 megahertz of spectrum available, or 194 actually, and the commission has been very active and actually just made an announcement yesterday, provided a whole host of licenses to many of our tribes, our Native American tribes, to provide licenses and connectivity, as they are, many of them in very rural, underserved areas. And this band is proving to be a very good way to try to connect some of those areas. So we are, as I said, moving forward on all fronts and focus not just on the big cities, but making sure we can cover the entire country. And this band is proving as very valuable in that front. And then for the areas that are not licensed, we are looking at an auction at some time in the future for the rest of the licenses here. Next slide, please. The commission also, we recently, looking a little higher within the mid-band, we released a notice of inquiry looking at the 500 megahertz at 12 gigahertz that is currently used by direct broadcast satellite TV. And we also have our MVDDS terrestrial service there, as well as increasingly we're starting to see NGSO service licensed. So we are looking, started an inquiry just really to gather information here. Actually, I'm sorry, it's proposed rulemaking. I'm mixing my proceedings up. Sorry about that. This was a notice of proposed rulemaking where we're seeking a lot of information and asking a lot of questions about how, if we can, and if so, how we can provide for more service in this band, particularly two-way service from the terrestrial side, as MVDDS currently is a one-way service. And this was initiated by a number of the MVDDS licensees who are, who are looking to try to expand service. So, so this, I won't say it'll be easy. It is a complicated band with a lot of users, but if we could find ways to make that work and increase the efficiency of the spectrum, I think, we're certainly all for that. But this is just getting underway, and I'll be real interested to see how the comments come in and see what folks come up with for interesting ways to look at sharing. Next slide, please. And then front and center currently, as some of the big movement happening in the 3 gigahertz band below our CBRS band. So the commission just released a draft yesterday for consideration at the next open meeting in March by the commission to adopt a report and order to provide for a licensing regime as well as auctioning of the 100 megahertz of spectrum at 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz. Last year, we took the first steps towards freeing up that spectrum by removing and some of the secondary users, which were non-federal users, radio location, weather radars, and moving them lower below 3.1 gigahertz, as well as an secondary amateur allocation. This band is heavily used by our Department of Defense, and this has a fairly unique approach in this band, as our Department of Defense, I think, and our federal government side recognize the importance of 5G and moving forward and freeing more spectrum up. And through a study over the summer, looked at how they could make as much spectrum in this band available for commercial use at full high power, and while still being able to fulfill their critical missions. And through that, they were able to identify a number of systems that can be either moved out of the band or adjust their concept of operations, while leaving a number of other areas where we could provide for commercial access to the spectrum with some coordination. And these are, we're calling them CUAs, PUAs. These are coordinated use areas and periodic use areas. So as the commission moves forward with an auction, the law says we have to auction, start an auction by the end of this year. The bidders will, once they are licensed, can work with our folks on the Department of Defense side to coordinate their usage and maximize even throughout those particular areas. So this, I'm hoping this becomes a model moving forward, as we can continue to work with our partners on the federal side and heavy users of the spectrum. I know I'm getting short on time, so let me skip ahead a little bit. If I can go through, go through next slide. Again, 70 and 80 gigahertz. As I mentioned, infrastructure, we certainly are looking at these bands to provide backhaul, and we've got an open proceeding here to see if we can increase the usage of that band. Millimeter wave bands above 95 gigahertz. I think this can provide, we've opened that up recently, and we're looking at some innovative uses here. Obviously, you don't have the range, but tremendous bandwidth, I think, for some very innovative uses. If we can keep moving, please. We have unlicensed use, 14 megahertz at 14 gigahertz, up in the 50, 60 gigahertz range. And folks are doing some unique things here, which, again, interesting. We are looking at an all-encompassing approach using licensed approaches, unlicensed approaches, so that folks can match business models to the spectrum and to what they want to do to find the best way to do things. If we can keep moving, 6 gigahertz, kind of jumping back to mid-band a little bit. We recently provided an expansion here, and I know folks in Europe have been heavily looking at this, as well as the rest of the world. But we opened that up, 1200 megahertz for unlicensed Wi-Fi use. I think folks are real excited looking at Wi-Fi 6 coming into this band. And again, somewhat of a unique set of rules looking at low power indoor usage and full-on high power outdoor usage subject to some database access in order to protect all the fixed incumbents. So this is just getting started. We're seeing equipment starting to hit the supply chains. So I think this is primed to take off in the near future too. Next slide, please. We also, again, on the technology side, we've have a notice of proposed rulemaking to update our marketing rules to looking at the current marketing models have evolved with the internet, and folks taking our rules right now prohibit direct marketing before equipment is approved. But looking at some of the internet models, and this will, if we can change that and allow some marketing, manufacturers, designers, developers, we think can better match what they're making, building, and filling the supply chains with what consumers actually want, and increasing efficiency here. And we think that's got tremendous potential for creating efficiencies within the market. Next slide, please. I'll mention real quick because I know I'm running out of time. Certainly, security is a big issue. And next slide, please. The commission, along with other agencies in the U.S., has certainly been looking at how to make sure our networks are secure. We've taken several actions under some laws that were passed where we have to evaluate the various suppliers. So certain suppliers can no longer, that equipment's no longer permissible for getting money under our Universal Service Fund, but there's money that's been provided for replacement. So we're looking at that, and along with that, next slide, please. Certainly looking at the open RAN. we Commission held a workshop in September, and just yesterday released a notice of inquiry, a draft notice of inquiry that's going to be voted at the March open meeting that is looking for information on how and what the Commission can do, what steps we can take to promote Open RAN, as certainly as that ties into certain efficiencies on the supplier side, redundancies for users and carriers, but also, as importantly, on the security side that could provide. So the Commission is moving forward on this. Next slide, please. I mentioned infrastructure. As I mentioned, ensuring we have the backhaul needed as we're looking at 70, 80 90 gigahertz bands. But we've also taken a lot of steps to streamline the siting process and create efficiencies here, in order to speed deployment. So we have a lot of initiatives moving on that front too. And next slide, please. And of course, funding is important. And just recently, our Congress, in their COVID relief fund, relief bill, provided a whole host of money in order to try to help with some of these deployments, especially in rural America. $20 billion for a rural digital opportunity fund to get high-speed broadband networks out to some of our more rural areas. We're also looking at there's money for providing broadband mapping, as well as we're looking at how to better provide for measuring the service in various areas, as well as through crowdsourcing apps and other measurement in order to make sure we get the coverage where we need. So I know that was real quick in the limited time, but that's kind of the issues I wanted to highlight for all the things happening here in the U.S. As I mentioned at the front, there's a lot moving. It's moving very fast, and a lot of folks here working to get all of these things done. And under our new acting chairwoman, she is certainly enthusiastic about pushing the 5G and moving forward on all these various fronts to make sure that the U.S. is well positioned to keep providing, for the folks out here. And I think there's a little bit of time left. I can take some questions. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you, Ira. Thank you, Ira. That was absolutely fantastic. And you've taken us through, I don't know how many auctions and public notices there are, but we just kind of had a master class on what's happening at the FCC. So excellent. Let me just, so we have a couple minutes, and we have a couple of questions which are on a theme I thought was excellent too, from Stephen Pentland at Vodafone. So let me just relay those questions. But, with the backdrop of what you mentioned, on the C-band auction that's just ended yesterday, closed about 5 times the value of the CBRS auction, which was earlier in the year, across the same range. But one of the differences is the sharing mechanism, obviously, that's in the CBRS. And so I guess the two related questions, one is, there are different ways of sharing. Do you anticipate that the CBRS model of sharing will get applied in other bands? And I guess related to that, so the sharing mechanism, for people that don't know, is managed by these spectrum access system operators, so the SASs. And if you have any early indications of interest in it, how is that going? Have they received a lot of interest in use of sharing mechanism like that, evidence of demand and whatnot? So that if you can answer those, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, obviously the observation of the different valuations that folks placed on the two bands, goes I think to two things. One, certainly the sharing mechanism, the exclusive use versus the sharing, but also you got to remember, at C-band it was 280 megahertz of spectrum, and in CBRS it was 70 megahertz of spectrum that actually got auctioned. And the difference is it's somewhat subtle to think about, and I'm not sure people always think about it in quite the right way. The auction at CBRS, because of the dynamic sharing regime we've put in there through the databases, it truly is dynamic. Folks who at the auctions who got their protected access licensees, those are not tied to a particular channel. I kind of think of it as almost a right of preemption, that when they want or need to use the spectrum, they are able to get on, and basically the general authorized, the next lower tier, those folks would get moved to other channels where they might be a little bit more crowded. So there, you can't. It's kind of apples and oranges. They're so different that I think it's really hard to compare. But the unique thing is what we were able to do is based on the unique properties of each band, who the incumbents were, and what we could do. We were able to provide different sharing mechanisms, different regimes that I think worked best for those particular bands, because the alternative is clearing. In the C band, the clearing, we have just satellite usage and some fixed usage, and for satellites, certainly there's a lot of rejiggering of transponders that have to go on in order to to provide the same service with less spectrum. Maybe some difference in coding and whatnot, but and from the hardware side on the ground, it's just adding adding filters, maybe some re-aiming of some satellites, as opposed to completely moving folks to different bands that have possibly different propagation properties, where more infrastructure may need to be built, transmitters need to be replaced. So there's always trade-offs and differences in costs, ease, efficiency of so it's you can't really compare them directly in that sense. Getting back to the other part of your question, I do think that the SAS model, it can certainly be applied to other bands. Right now, the database providers, the SAS providers, have asked us to look at that on certain bands. We'll certainly take that under advisement as we move forward into different bands. It's certainly a model to look at and use, but I couldn't predict today what might happen in the future, on that model. But it seems to be working pretty well to date, and it usage seems to be expanding. So
yeah, I agree. That's kind of the feedback we've had too. So let me just ask you one other quickie, because I know we don't want to chew into Mohammed's time here, but I guess one of the things that might be high on the mind of everyone is just sort of the agenda. I think the PI Commission was very aggressive on auctions in the last couple of years. I think 5 spectrum auctions plus the 2 subsidy auctions. Is that, do you think, particularly with the success of the C-band, that Jessica Rosenhussel will keep on that agenda basically, or what's your thought on that quickly?
And again, I can't speak for the acting chairwoman at this point, and she's only been on the job for a month, but right. But based on some of her early announcements and some of the work she did as a commissioner, I know she is certainly. I expect her to be pushing to make more spectrum available as quickly as we can. I mean, you already see we're continuing to move at 3.45 to 3.55. We've got the report and order come, as well as auctions procedures public notice scheduled for the March agenda meeting in just 3 weeks. She, as a commissioner, was a big proponent of pushing forward on some of the unlicensed side at 6 gigahertz. She was a big supporter of that, supporter of some of the actions we took at 5.9. And I certainly think she will basically keep the pedal to the metal, so to speak, in trying to free up as much spectrum as we can, right. And provide for those needs.
Good to hear. Okay, it should be interesting going forward. A lot of activity there. So I guess we should probably move on. So thank you very much. I very much appreciate it. As I often say to people, talking about spectrum is sometimes a bit like trying to sip a glass of water from a fire hydrant. And so if we could move on to Mohammed El-Taibi, welcome and good to see you. And the KSA has been extremely active in the last few months getting on spectrum strategy. So I'm sure you have a lot to tell us as well. Mohammed is on the CITC, which is the spectrum responsible for radio spectrum in Saudi Arabia. He's been involved in spectrum management for a long time, including drafting their current spectrum strategy 2025, and I believe there's a new outlook out as well. I'm sure you'll tell us all about that. So let me hand it over to you with no further ado. Thank you, man.
Thank you very much, Rob. I really appreciate. Thank you for Forum Europe for hosting me. Really appreciate it. I'll try to. Era was very comprehensive on explaining how the United States is moving forward with the spectrum. So I'll try to make this presentation complement what he said, as most of the countries across the globe is heading toward the same direction with different approaches and different timeline. You go next slide, please. So if I can summarize this in 1 minute, we, in order to present ourselves as a national spectrum manager, we have different demands from different sectors across the kingdom. In Saudi Arabia, CITC is the only national spectrum manager. So we have to look after all different uses across all sectors, whether it's for commercial, 5G and satellite or other sector that concerned with safety and saving lives of people. So we had to develop, in 2019, we developed the National Spectrum Strategy, which have this national look on how we should manage spectrum. It looks at the supply, it looks at the demand of spectrum, how can we meet both, and also build a foundation for the way that we monitor and make spectrum used efficiently. One of the pillars in that strategy actually was the innovative and enhancing innovative and commercial use of spectrum. So this is what the consultation about. In the mid of last year, 2020, we published a consultation asking a lot of questions. And we got really good and tremendous response and interactive responses from all industry across the globe. This is what shows how spectrum actually is an international, need a lot of international harmonization. So we've talked to the satellite, people from satellite industry, from mobile industry, from all other sort of technologies, industries and association. And we ended up with drafting the last month in January, a draft spectrum outlook, which actually currently we are consulting about on our CITC website. And that, as well as we published all the responses and our assessment of all the, I would say, not conflicted, but different opinions about how the use of spectrum between different industries. What we try with that, when we bring everybody to the same level about there are a finite number of bands and there are many wireless technology. It's a rapid increase that we have to adapt. It's become necessity in the future. So we needed to really get it right before we could release the spectrum for usage. One other issues that we looked at is that what we wanted to ensure there is enough or many, we could adapt as many technologies as we could for the benefit of the country, for the different sectors. And we try to turn this competition on spectrum access into complementarity between these technologies, because this is actually what the case, and you can see it in many examples between different technologies. If you go to the next slide, please. So, in a nutshell, I will go in details about these three different approaches that we went for the spectrum. But I'll give you an overview, which is about 20 gigahertz we plan to release starting from next month. So we will be releasing spectrum in three different approaches. One on licensed spectrum with exclusive access, one with license exempt spectrum where it's common, shared by everybody as long as they adhere to some rules, and a hybrid between, which is lightly licensed, that could be named different names, but we call it lightly licensed spectrum, which we try to relax the exclusivity and create some sort of sharing between different users and different technologies. Next slide, please. So for the licensed spectrum, on each one of these three methods or regime to allocate the spectrum, we were trying to look into what do we need to do for updating the regulations or to create a new regulation in order to make this or minimize the risk for investment in all three levels of spectrum mechanism or licensing. And also we were trying to look at the different bands that we should release for which, under which method. So we were looking at the sub 1 gigahertz band between 1 and 6, which we usually called on nowadays mid bands, and we were looking at the higher bands and the millimetric waves band. If you could go to the next slide, please. So we were trying to, as I mentioned earlier, to enable as many wireless technology as possible, because we believe that there will be the future is an array of different technologies. There will be no dominant technology, and we don't think that will be the technologies. All of them will be a mainstream. So it's not something that backed up. Even, for example, in the past, we used to look at the satellite with the geostationary satellites. They are kind of a backup for some ground links. Today, it's moving. The technology improved so well that it presents itself as a mainstream where it can provide directly to the user services. So we will be across all the bands, which I'll go over in the next few slides. We were looking at the different technologies and different technologies we're trying to enable, and the what should we do with the access regime, which bands as which technology could fit or could be more usable or have more use cases in the lower bands, which usually the technologies or application with which require a higher full mobility, usually the mobile connectivity and also the mission critical applications. We were looking at the mid band, which sits with most of the technologies that we look today, and also the high bands, which actually usually it's kind of less than a network. It's more like personal use or very close range use of different application. Next slide, please. First, I'll spend just 1 or 2 minutes on the for license spectrum. We plan to license 4 gigahertz of spectrum, mostly by through a competitive process like auction, especially if the demand is exceeding the supply. The thing is that we were very careful. We know that's the same old methods was auction and made probably having a lot of returns for the government, but this wasn't the case. We were trying to minimize in our approach the exclusivity. We think the future or the technology that will take us to the future, the technology that can learn how to coexist. We were trying to minimize the exclusivity even between users. So we think even when we have exclusive license, it should have some form of coexistence or compatibility between different users, even if they are using the same technology. Why? This is a limited resource, and we need to find a way that we can utilize it to the maximum level. So we were looking at especially bands in the sub gigahertz, which like half of the list here, and we were looking at bands in below 3 gigahertz, which are another 3 bands, mainly the C band, part of the C band, and also the 1500 megahertz band. We were also looking at one of the millimetric waves band that could have actually application or 5G, mainly fixed wireless access or point to multi-point fixed application. And we will plan to do this over the next 3 years. So there will be an auction this year, and there will be an auction next year as well. And we are consulting about it. We are waiting for responses from our partners across the globe, and also whether it's existing investors or players in the Saudi market or the potential ones for different industry. We were trying as much as we could. Most of these bands, usually the exclusivity today, when we just made a quick review, I could make a general statement. The exclusivity is always required by the IMT or the terrestrial IMT technology, which we understand for the time being to allow certainty for investment. However, we think these technologies, especially 5G technology, probably need to find ways to be able to coexist with either some other technology or multiple users operating in the same band. Usually policy lagging behind technology. Now we are trying to create kind of progressive policy to enable efficient use and to minimize even the job of us spectrum manager, not to be the man in the middle all the time and telling who using what. However, technology and development of technology, will put a lot on their shoulders, that they need to find technologies that listen before talk and find a way to coexist and provide good quality of service while maintaining compatibility and coexistence with other usage. If you go to the next slide. So what we are doing for the licensed spectrum, we are trying to add a little part of, with this exclusivity comes some dynamic and flexible regulation and policies. We are trying to create some market mechanism and spectrum sharing, allow spectrum trading. All these we are going to consult about it just after this huge outlook consultation or a major one. We are trying also, we always think that yes, investors need some certainty, needs to minimize risk. We are trying to work with that, even if that means increasing the license term. As long as we could find a way that they can actually utilize this spectrum efficiently. From past, if you look at this outlook and the responses and even the first consultation that we published, we used to show cases where actually exclusivity doesn't lead to good utilization of spectrum, which actually not in line with what we suppose to do as spectrum manager and to try to achieve. I'll go very quickly over 2 more or 3 slides. So the next slide, please. So for the license exempt, I think we are following the leadership of my colleague from FCC. We are trying to find or to allocate enough spectrum for license exempt. People label it as Wi-Fi, but actually it's not just for Wi-Fi, it's for technology. For example, even the NR unlicensed, they could utilize that band. We are still consulting about it if we should allow the whole band, 1200 megahertz. And also we are looking at higher bands for the Y-gig technologies, which needs a gigabit speeds. In addition, we are trying to make trial and enough space for the V2X proof itself. Probably it's still toward the end of the research and development phase. So we are trying to find some allocates of spectrum, and with hope that we could even allocate more because it's very important application. Next slide, please. So the last part of our approach toward the future of having more spectrum released for innovative and commercial users to look into a lightly licensed model where we actually make like kind of light registration, but actually control, not just make it license exempt open for everybody. We are trying to control the unnecessary access. We are trying to minimize the tragedy of commons, and at the same time we are trying to increase the number of users who can use technology that learn and able to coexist. If you go to the next slide, please. So we are doing a lot of consultation, or actually we plan to do it by the mid of this year. We are trying to look into databases approaches. We know that probably we are experimenting with that. We hope that we could make the spectrum management. We are trying to create a little bit of abundance for the user to use spectrum whenever it's available, instead of us making a decision as spectrum manager. We know this is not going to happen overnight or with just the minute that we announce the license. It will take a little bit of time from all parties, the technology providers, the users, and also the spectrum manager. So we are trying to look into all different sort to create this environment for lightly licensed regimes and different industry. Next slide, please. As you can, I mean, I don't want to spend a long time. I'm a little bit over time, maybe. So we looked into different bands. We're trying to, as you've seen, there is a lot of talks that probably the usual same old service provider, they are not meeting the vertical's needs. We are trying to experiment with this slight licensing to see how could we create some solution in the middle where we find a way that some developing technologies like hubs and fixed wireless access, some customized or tailored application for the industrial users and another sector, how can they could utilize the spectrum with some limitation. But by limitation, I mean there will be no full exclusivity when trying to use the spectrum. This is, I think, it's the right step toward the right way to find a way that we can have, I would say, efficient ecosystem between the manager, between the users, between the technology to utilize the spectrum. There is a lot of wireless application that happenings that become part of our daily life, and it's on our shoulders that we make this usable, applicable, without having to use the old models of exclusive license spectrum to every user, to every use and everywhere. With this, I would probably end my presentation, and thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I'm a little bit over time.
All right, thank you. I'm back. Yes, thank you. That was very interesting, as I suspected. A lot there. So we have a couple minutes for questions. One that came in might take a little bit of time to answer, but there's probably maybe there's a fast answer to it. But let me relay the question and see if we can handle it in a reasonable amount of time. So KSA is taking some innovative approaches in a range of bands, as we just saw in your presentation. How do you see decisions in the bands like 6 gigahertz and particularly UHF? I guess, do these fit with WRC 23, or are you doing things in advance, or how is that? How does that?
Yeah.
So that could be a long answer, but we could try to have the short answer.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the document, the draft outlook is on our website, and I would love, and also the responses to the consultation. And we heard from everybody. We heard from especially the broadcasters, and we really have good engagement locally and regionally, and even beyond the region or the Arab region, which is also Region 1, with our colleagues in APU. And we found that the utilization of spectrum in the 600 megahertz band is very, very low. And there was some consultation within the Arab Group League, Arab Spectrum Management Group, and it's still unofficial. Yes, we know that in WRC 23 that will be studied, and it's under study. However, we think there are a lot of need for more spectrum in the sub-gigahertz band, and especially in a vast country like Saudi Arabia, where we want people to have access to 5G. We couldn't do that just with the 2.6 and 3.5. We have to go lower, and it was. It's not a final decision. However, this is the approach. There is some form of agreement. We are waiting to hear from people, but we think it's the best for utilizing this resource for the good of the country, especially that the terrestrial broadcasting in this region, and I would say in GCC countries in general, that we don't have much demand for it. It's either through satellite or it's through some digital platforms where people stream contents. Yes, we definitely, this is not even, we are just talking about rebacking some of the, because we think there is, for national reason, we have to have broadcasters, terrestrial broadcasters that have access to some spectrum, so they can have access to, people can have access to local and diverse contents. However, a lot of consultation, we think this is the way to go. We hope the WRC 23 decision will support that. However, we have to make a progressive kind of spectrum policy, a little bit maybe a step ahead, in order to ensure that there is a sustainability and we can actually adopt this 5G evolution.
Right. Okay. Okay. No, it makes sense. Clearly, lots of there's a lot of issues around WRC 23 and the WRCs in general, and countries have to position themselves, and get things done earlier sometimes, and move with the flows other times. So appreciate that, Mohammed. That's very good. And I think we're kind of have to move on in time, but excellent presentation. And I think it's given a lot of people a lot of insight. You guys are very busy. I noticed 2 auctions coming up. Everything's 2022. So you got your plate full. And congratulations. And thank you very much. Dan, I guess should we move to the panel, I guess? Okay, segue right into the panel. There we are. I'm up again. So we have a great panel coming up. So in that, I think we have some good contextual background on the US. We didn't get too much, we thought about the sharing mechanism. I think that might be an interesting thing to explore a bit more, the CBRS approach that applying in 5G and how that relates. So our panel looking at bands, basically bands and connections. So saving the best material for last. So we have a great panel from the EC, from ANFR, Broadcast Network Europe, GSMA, and ESOA, Intelsat as well. So if I go to the next chart, just to, I'll introduce each of the panelists, but just to introduce myself first. We're a consulting firm based in Montreal. We do a lot of work in 5G spectrum strategy and auctions, and so that obviously involves, bands, what they're worth and what they are and where they are and whatnot. Next chart. So just to situate ourselves, obviously the Pioneer bands was sort of a discussion point, from earlier on the 5G Pioneer band, 700 mid-band and upper band, the 26 in region 1. There are lots and lots of other bands, that could be 5G. Some of them are existing bands of 3G that have been migrated over. They could be new bands available in other regions. So there's a whole bunch of them. So we'll try and situate ourselves here, looking at other bands as well and migrating into 6G and up into the terahertz range. Next chart. I've been told I need to go reasonably quickly because we're a bit over time. So as Ira talked about the US auctions in the middle here in blue, that certainly provides an interesting context. And I think, something to consider, a sharing mechanism versus exclusive licensing. Here in Canada, we're kind of overlapping in the similar range. The European 5G bands or Pioneer bands are shown up top. And obviously all this is merging into 3GPP band N77, which is a very important overriding trend for technology and ecosystem that we can see. In other words, while it looks like a big patchwork today, different countries moving things around, it will eventually all migrate into being one big happy family. Next chart. So the mid-band is the focus. Ira mentioned this briefly. This is a quick view, I think, contextually about bands. The column on the left is the average value of the 3500 range from 8 international auctions. The second one is the US CBRS auction, and the third one is the C-band auction, which went for 5 times the value. So I think it's a reasonable contextual point to keep in mind as we're talking about these things. We're talking about sharing mechanisms, we're talking about different bands, the values of bands, the evolution of 5G and capacity. Next chart. So just some thematic discussion points. There's a couple paragraphs on the conference website, basically looking at what are the different bands, which are the most realistic ones. Obviously, people want large contiguous blocks. So one of the things we saw in the US C-band result, Verizon ended up with about 170, 180 megahertz of continuous spectrum in the C-band. So what are the opportunities for that in different bands? What are the additional bands beyond the Pioneer bands? The UHF, so we'll talk about that. Obviously, there's a broadcast position compared to the telecom industry. We'll certainly hear about that. Other C-band, mid-band opportunities, other users, refarming and whatnot, valuations in light of the recent auctions. Use cases, I think we've heard a lot earlier, and it's probably something else that can come up here. Frequencies for vertical sectors, are they new bands? It's just a question of giving them portions of band. Is it something that compromises 5G deployment, or is it complementary to it? And the role of other technologies in satellite, and then evolution of 6G. So next chart. I won't take up any more time. I think that's sort of the thematic elements. Hopefully we'll get some good questions. As I mentioned, we have a stellar panel. So we'll start with Branimir Stanchev from the European Commission. He's responsible. We can bring up Branimir, I'm sure. I'll segue to him. He's responsible at the EC for wireless spectrum for wireless broadband, and is focused on 5G. He's been with the Commission since 2008, and involved in wireless equipment design and manufacturing background. So tons of technical, interesting background. And I'll hand it right over to you. What are the new bands and where are we headed? Go for it.
Thank you very much, Rob. And I would like to first thank to Forum Europe for the opportunity to speak and present the European Commission's view. And also to thank them for this very rich agenda we have in this conference coming now towards the end. I will start with recalling that back in 2016, the European Commission adopted the 5G Action Plan. Subsequently, the RSPG, the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, developed a spectrum roadmap for the European Union, and this was endorsed by the Commission. One major element in this spectrum roadmap was the inclusion of millimeter wave spectrum. This was also driven by the agenda of the WRC 19. So we had a sort of already a shift in our spectrum horizon towards millimeter waves and moving from a spectrum target of 1200 megahertz for 4G towards 10 times more and above for 5G. Next slide, please. So we are now in the process of implementing the 5G spectrum roadmap. As you will probably know, we have the 3 5G pioneer bands in the Union, which have been harmonized. They are now in the process of ongoing authorization. This process is still with a bit delay in comparison to the deadlines which are required. We have 18 member states which have authorized 3.6 gigahertz, sometimes in parts, not in full. We have 14 member states having authorized 700 megahertz. And if I include Germany now, we have 4 member states which are authorizing or have authorized parts or in full the 26 gigahertz band, which is still not a very good result. We're moving along to finish our job in making all spectrum harmonized for wireless broadband fit for 5G use. In 2020, we accomplished this for the 2.6 and the paired 2 gigahertz band. This year, by the end of this year, we should do the same with the 900, 1800 megahertz bands. And at the same time, we want to harmonize further spectrum in the millimeter wave range, most notably 42 gigahertz, for which the CPT is developing the technical conditions. I also expect that we will not have much to do for the upper range 66 gigahertz, where in the Union we have currently about 14 gigahertz of spectrum for short-range devices, which appears to be suitable for 5G use according to preliminary results from the CPT. We are looking much at ensuring balance between public and private networks as demanders for spectrum. And a lot has been said in this conference about the increasing demand and importance of private networks, in the first place with local coverage for enterprises, but also for transport hubs. If we look at other verticals, not only Industry 4.0, I must point out that we have also provided additional harmonization of spectrum for connected and automated driving. And this is at the 5.9 gigahertz range, and also we are doing now the same for railway mobile radio. We look at mid-band spectrum, which is on the agenda of WRC 23. And of course, here there are some conflicting requirements we have to take into account, but this is an ongoing process. At the same time, we have already started work towards 6G in the research domain, and I expect there that maybe some action should be necessary in a few years to set objectives and to set a spectrum strategy, possibly with the role of the RSPG, and also looking at further spectrum and further extending the spectrum horizon towards the terahertz range. Next slide, please. So overall, we are in a process now in a sort of a midterm in a process which has started with the launch of 5G, initial launch, now taking place in most member states. And we expect 5G to be deployed in mass-wise towards 2025. So we're looking at additional spectrum needs, and we are relying here on the agenda of the RSPG. This is also a point of time where we are trying to look wider in our spectrum strategy, recognizing the spectrum policies embedded in the digital and green policies at union level, which are currently being developed. At the same time, looking at the further deployment of 5G, we are looking at the sectoral deployment agendas, which have been developed for connected driving, connected rail, and this drives further our considerations, in particular regarding the authorization of spectrum, the development of coherent models for authorization across borders, where we think that not only technical harmonization conditions, but also coherent approaches of member states on how spectrum should be managed will help to ensure high quality of service and good coverage to support such services. On the research side, you have heard already from my colleagues that we have developments towards 6G in order to develop the vision, technology, and the value chain, in particular with focus on the developing components within the union with a view to the digital autonomy policy we're following. In the current research programs, we have a flagship project plus 8 further exploratory projects. And in the next program, we have made a proposal for a smart networks and services joint undertaking, which will deliver, among other things, also the research views on new use cases and possibly new chances for spectrum availability and use. And last but not least, the work at the union level is certainly embedded in international developments. Here, we may differentiate between short-term and longer-term developments. In the short term, we are looking at the 5G roadmap, which the CPT is following. At ITU level, I mentioned already WRC 23, the agenda, which will look at not only at mid-band spectrum, but also at other areas related to satellite use, which also well linked to other union policies. And looking further in the long term, of course, the take-up or let's say the experimentation and take-up of higher frequencies will be very high on the agenda, but this is not immediate. And here, the CPT, the ITU are having already initiatives. Also, some other countries like the US with the Spectrum Horizons. These are things which we will further monitor in order to develop our priorities further and to rely on a solid evidence base. This will be my summary, and I'll be glad to move to the discussion after handing the floor to my colleagues. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much, Branimir. Yes, I think we'll do all the panelists, and we'll have questions after, I think is the format. So we'll move straight away to the next speaker. So thank you very much, Branimir. And the next speaker, I think probably needs a little introduction to many people, Eric Fournier, who's with the France's National Frequency Management Agency, the ANFR. Eric is well known in that context and also quite involved in RSPG, so I'm sure he'll give us some good insight into some of the activities there, particularly millimeter wave, mid-band, and all the hot topics. So Eric, let me pass it over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. That's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to Forum Europe for this always exciting 5G conference. Next slide, please. So before discussing what should be the new band, question is really what's the need for new bands? Okay, as usual, spectrum efficiency. We know that there are some physical limits, Shannon limits. We know that there's possibility of increasing base station density. That's something where there's no real physical limitation, but probably some economical limitation. But ultimately, that's the way our operators are facing the increase of capacity in the real world. And new bands in this respect can only help, and that could be no change within the order of magnitude. If you take the spectrum below 4 gigahertz, if In Europe, you have more or less 1 gigahertz of spectrum which is available. You add on that a few hundred of megahertz. It will not change really the situation for operator and the capacity of networks. Now, what is important is really to focus on the need in specific frequency range. For the millimeter wave in Europe, there's 3 gigahertz and 26 gigahertz, 3 gigahertz and 40 gigahertz, which will be harmonized in 2 years time frame. There's 40 gigahertz on a license basis with 55 dBm EIRP, which is available at the 60 gigahertz range. So there's a big amount of gigahertz which is available, and you could see the pool at the previous session where there was only 20% of the audience saying that there will be need in 26 gigahertz before 3 years. Mid-bands, that's the opposite. You could see the presentation from Saudi Arabia and from FCC, and there's a kind of international ways for getting more spectrum in this mid-band. Joan Lemay in the previous session say that Verizon secures something like 170 megahertz nationwide in US for 5G in this frequency band. So that's something which is enormous, and that's showing that the demand is clear here. Now, lower band, it's probably only few tenths of megahertz which could be made available at some point of time. Of course, if you have more spectrum here, that could help mobile operators to increase the capacity in rural areas, but it's certainly not something which is the most prominent priority. Next slide, please. Focusing on 2 frequency bands, 6 gigahertz, which is for the mid-band, obviously, high profile for WRC23 and limited to region 1. Here, I would like to insist on the C-band, satellite C-band paradox. If you are looking to the downlink frequency band for satellite, now in Europe, it's more or less limited to 3842, so it has shrunk to 400 megahertz only. When for the uplink band, so for the 6 gigahertz, you have more than 1 gigahertz of spectrum which is available for coordinated earth station, but without any real constraints. So it's making things unbalanced, which could lead to the conclusion that there's probably some capacity here, but at the same time, and that's really what is WRC23 difficulty, there's probably a difficulty in ensuring the international obligations of all member states in ITU, which is to protect satellite of other countries. It's not a national issue, it's really an international issue. There's obviously some other services which have to be addressed, but it's more something at a national level. And you have what has been often mentioned, this debate in access to this spectrum, 0.6 gigahertz between Wi-Fi and 5G debate. I would concur with what has been said by Andreas in a previous session. That's really for after WRC23. For the UHF band, also high profile. For our perspective, the evolution of broadcasting will really lead the possibility to have some additional spectrum here for mobile. Just to know that it's not only additional band for IMT, there's also some request to access to this frequency band for PPDR or for military mobile ad hoc network. So it's not just IMT broadcasting, it's something larger than that. And there's also this difficulty or this opportunity of 5G broadcast. It's something which would certainly help because it's reducing the cross-border coordination issue because it's downlink like normal broadcasting, which may leave the possibility to have something which would be based on demand of individual member state and situation in individual member state. But at the same time, 5G broadcast demand is still to be demonstrated. Next slide, please. One specific reference to vertical needs. In the mid-bands, each member state has made different choice. German famous one, 3738. In France, we have allocated the TDD part of 2.6 gigahertz for vertical. Some other have taken 3.5 gigahertz, 2.3. Some have no specific frequency band for vertical here. So that's something which is quite fragmented. It has been already mentioned, the 3842, which could be made available for local coverage, vertical with need to protect earth station, what I mentioned before. with low and medium power only, which limits the interest of this frequency band. It's only for study, so it's not in the RSPG opinion on RSPP, but it's on the one on additional spectrum need. And I also invite you to respond to this public consultation from RSPG. For millimeter wave, there's much more options probably possible, and more opportunities to reach some common options and consistent approach among member states. So that's something which is also a question raised in this public consultation. So thanks a lot, and I'm eager to exchange with the panelists and with the audience. Thank you.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Eric. That's great. And there's certainly a lot there in the RSPG consultation, so something worth talking about, and perhaps we'll get some questions to direct on that and follow up on some of those interesting points and important developments for the future. So on to our next, the order is slightly different than I had in my presentation. One small mistake I had. So Mohamed Jawad will be up next. And Mohamed is representing the EWIA Satellite Association, responsible for global spectrum and regulatory policy. It's an important role there. I should add that Mohamed is with Intelsat, so he has a lot of background in satellite and should bring some interesting perspective with over 10 years experience in the industry and in regulatory and market access issues and whatnot. So Mohamed, let me turn that over to you.
Thank you very much, and greetings to all from London. My name is Mohamed Jawad, and in this session we will be talking about what new frequencies could cover connectivity for 5G and beyond, which I'm sure we'll get into the discussion in the panel later on. But before that, I wanted just to spend a bit of time in my opening remarks just to mention some key elements relevant to us today, just to bring some perspective into the conversation. Let's first start with the harmonization. Certainly, this is a challenge for regulators. As the only satellite representative in the panel, it's not always easy or possible for me to look at matters from the prism of one region, purely because of our industry operates globally. For example, just one satellite can cover a third of the globe. And in Intelsat, we operate over 50 satellites. Now, with that said, we all know that ITU Region 1 covers Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and RCC region. As each of these regions have significantly different uses of spectrum, which is driven by different regulatory provisions. Therefore, we should not take a wholesale approach to harmonization, because each region and sometimes sub-regions are different and they have different requirements. So whenever possible, you harmonize at the extent you can on the common denominator. In Europe, for 5G and in C-band, in the mid-band, I believe this is between the 3.4 to 3.8, where the common harmonization has been reached today. In Europe, this 400 megahertz in the mid-band is where the harmonization is more adequate to meet the 5G demand for the foreseeable future. There's also the possibility to refarm existing 2G and 3G spectrum. Just thinking outside the box here, this has not been mentioned before. 2G and 3G networks might be decommissioned over the coming years. And using this 2G and 3G spectrum is much more cost effective than acquiring additional spectrum. Plus you have the sub 100 gigahertz, sub 1 gigahertz and the millimeter bands for indoor capacity use in the future. But just to resonate some of the comments mentioned by Eric in his presentation, we have heard many times, especially from the manufacturers, and this is before 5G spectrum auctions were announced, that a fundamental requirement to achieve 5G would be the need for contiguous bandwidth, 80 to 100 per MNO, we've heard. Otherwise, you cannot deliver 5G. However, today we have seen, and thanks partly to TDD technologies, you can actually aggregate other bands where the bandwidth needed is the maximum aggregated system bandwidth and not necessarily a contiguous bandwidth. Therefore, we can support a single or multiple radio frequency carriers to deliver 5G. There are reports such as ITU M2410 and others that adhere to that. Of course, I can understand from the manufacturer's point of view, it is desirable to roll out equipment on a cost-effective way, but it is not absolutely necessary to achieve 5G, especially when to achieve this would mean impacting on other services. If you look at the slides in front of you, I believe there is a risk of spectrum oversupply to 5G. throwing more spectrum at MNOs is not going to solve connectivity challenges. Rather, this would lead to spectrum oversupply, leading to non-competitive auctions and lower auction revenues. If you look at the next slide, for example, auctions where MNOs purchase greater than 100 megahertz have realized lower revenue, whereas auctions of 300 megahertz or less typically realize higher revenues. Also, it's worth noting, for example, Austria, where the auctions in 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz band, where some of that spectrum remains unsold, I believe. So there is a risk where valuable spectrum, and spectrum doesn't grow on trees. We all need the spectrum to grow our industry. But there is a risk that valuable spectrum remains unsold or sometimes underutilized for extended periods. So we need to balance the supply and demand. Simply coming to every WRC asking for more spectrum isn't sustainable, nor does it cater for efficient use of spectrum. And what about the global mobile data traffic offload to Wi-Fi? As we have mostly been working from home during 2020, I believe most of the mobile data connectivity and activity has taken place within the user's home. For example, this conference right now, I believe most of us are connected in a Wi-Fi connection. So a sizable proportion of this traffic generated by mobile is actually offloaded into the fixed network, such as Wi-Fi. Furthermore, we have seen that with 4G plans, they are all subject to data caps similar to 3G plans. It is expected that Wi-Fi offloading is going to continue to grow, and I believe as 5G is being introduced, a lot of that offloading will be done on such networks. I believe there are figures from Cisco that say up to 71% by 2022 of traffic will be offloaded on Wi-Fi connectivity. There are various statistics, but nobody can deny that the need for offloading traffic is happening on our cost-effective means. So this all begs the question, is more spectrum really needed? As Eric mentioned, I think an interesting study that was done by the UK regulator, Ofcom, where in response to claims by some manufacturers that each MNO needs access to 80 to 100 megahertz of contiguous spectrum, what Ofcom have done is they've researched the ability of mobile operators, not the manufacturers, but the mobile operators, when they have launched 5G services after their first auction in the UK in the 3.4 to 3.6 gigahertz. What they've discovered is that you can actually achieve 5G speeds with just 40 megahertz of spectrum. And there was no evidence that 5G could not be delivered with smaller non-contiguous carriers in other frequency bands. And I think the figures were floating of 770 megabits in the download speeds with 440 megabits in the upload speed with just 40 megahertz of spectrum. This is well within the range of what the consumer is expecting in the mobile handset at least. So my final message is that marketing promise regarding 5G services must be balanced with the reality, especially when such decisions will impact our industry from a GSO perspective. It will impact access to the downlink C-band spectrum that we use today. And FSS spectrum has already been reduced. Right now, we're only operating in the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz. And our industry relies heavily on investment that comes from an established regulatory certainty that we all desire. So with that, I will end my opening remarks, and I'll be happy to continue the discussion in regards to sharing and how we best achieve that in other frequency bands. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, man. That was interesting. Certainly a couple of points that may come back in questions there, on the supply-demand curve and whatnot. Interesting contextual discussion. But we'll come back to some of that in the questioning, no doubt. So let's move on to Lars Backlund. Lars is the Secretary General of Broadcast Networks Europe, based in Brussels, representing the interests of the terrestrial broadcast community in Europe, 21 countries, and with policy regulatory development, basically European institutions and the ITU. He's got a lot of background in satellite too, so he may actually give us some other perspectives on that, and has been background in the European Space Agency and the World Bank. So Lars, let me hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, as everybody else, I wish to express a great thank you and appreciation to Forum Europe for arranging the conference. Even if I've been in satellite before, I'll stick to ground this time. And I'll be talking about spectrum for broadcast and media services. And of course, a hot topic which everybody's interested in is what will happen at the WRC 23 on the agenda 1.5 in the UHF band in region 1. And of course, our interest is what will happen with terrestrial television, digital terrestrial television, 5G broadcast, media production, PMSC, and possibly others shared services. And I'll also say that the broadcast sector is, of course, not sitting still, and we are currently doing extensive studies and having initiatives to look at what could 5G bring to the broadcast sector, and we're having an open mind to that as well. But before going further, next slide, just to tell you who we are the broadcast network operators throughout Europe. It's all the major terrestrial network operators in most of the European countries. So what about DTT, digital terrestrial television? As we see it, it is a worldwide success. It exists in a majority of countries. It's on air or on early trials. And if we look just in region 1 in Europe, Africa, Middle East, we have 105 countries with DTT on air and a typical coverage of 70 to more than 98% of the population. In Europe, we have some 250 million viewers that are looking at watching TV some 3 hours, 30 minutes per pop. And this has actually increased during the pandemic. And we have something like 2,000 TV channels. So what about the future? If we look at the next slide, please. There was an ITU questionnaire in 2020 in region 1, where administrations were asked, what about the need for the 224 megahertz that's currently allocated to the broadcast service? And most countries actually said, yes, we need that also in the future. And that is a fairly clear indication that there is a big interest to retain the broadcast service in region 1. So what do we think about the UHF band from our view? If we look at the next slide. If we look at the future use of the UHF band in region 1, obviously the RSPG has considered the policy target to make more than 12 gigahertz harmonized spectrum below 100 gigahertz available for wireless services, including 5G, 6G, and similar services. And the conclusion in the RSPG consultation report is that more than that is already available. And if we look at the allocation currently for the broadcast service for 70 to 694, it represents about 2% of comparable and available bandwidth. So it's not so much. I think it must also be noted that today the broadcast sector has been quite active. We've been clearing the 800 megahertz band and the 700 megahertz band, and this is completed or almost completed. And we have been quite innovative to do more in less spectrum. Might be the opposite in other industries that always need more spectrum, but we are actually using less spectrum to do more service. And however, even with this now, with the 800 and 700 clear, we think we are at a crossroads, and we're no longer talking about additional digital dividends. We're rather talking about regulations and decisions which may eliminate an important industry and strategic asset in Europe. And obviously, this is more a political decision than a technical decision. It's quite important. So what do we think? What is our view on the agenda point 1.5 in the next slide? we think that it would be sensible to retain the 470 to 694 megahertz band for broadcasting and downlink only media services also beyond 2030. We think that at the WRC23 there need to be no change of the allocation of this band. We think that we foresee that DTT will remain attractive and remain for a long time. But we also think that 5G broadcast will be introduced as a new complementary service to reach mainly mobile phones, tablets, and cars, which is obviously we have an open mind to do that. We think that we will continue sharing with PMSE, radio astronomy, and white spaces. And also, the door is not closed to other services in the band. And the GEO6 framework already allows services to be established in the 470 to 694 for countries which may not use the DTT and these frequencies so much for broadcasting. I think we must also note that DTT is energy efficient and green. And last but not least, it must be recognized that the 470 to 694 and the media services in this band remains instrumental for the European cultural content production and media sector, which obviously involves many more than regulators and technical considerations. It has to do with culture, with society, and similar things. So in summary, on the next slide, we think that DTT will remain strong, important. It's here to stay for a long time. We think that 5G broadcast will become a new complement to reach mainly mobiles and mobile phones, tablets, and cars. We think that continued availability of the sub-700 is important for the broadcasting service and also well beyond 2030. It's instrumental for the cultural content production and media sectors. It is environmentally friendly with broadcast services, and we think this is the way it should go at the WRC23. And I think that summarizes our view on this. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lars. We're certainly building up in presentations here, getting a bit more controversial with each one. So some interesting points there. Hopefully we'll come back in questions and we can all talk a bit more about UHF and impacts of COVID and supply and demand and things like that. Good, so on to GSMA. So Luciana Camargos is the Senior Director of Future Spectrum at GSMA. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the GSMA, and Luciana is responsible for the coordination application of industry positions on spectrum. Hopefully she'll come up on the stage here in a second. And is responsible for the GMSA's Future Spectrum Group. We got Dan instead. Dan.
I was going to say, Luciana, there seems to be some issue with your video. If you could just maybe refresh your feed, Luciana, and hopefully that will, if you come back into the studio, hopefully that will sort that. Sorry, Rob, continue with your instruction. Hopefully Luciana will come up and we can bring her up. Okay. Sure,
I can talk all day, no problem. We'll wait till Luciana comes back. No, a little technical glitch. Oh, there she is. Okay, sorry about that. So yes, Luciana originally was working with GSMA in Brazil and is now in the UK, and has experience with Anatel and with various international organizations, the ITU, CTEL, CPT, and others. So Luciana, let me pass it over to you. What are the new bands and all the exciting things we're waiting for?
Thank you very much. And hi, everyone. Greetings. Also from London, now from London. And it's quite weird to have my photo on this slide, considering you can all see my face here, but there we go. It's a pleasure being here in the Forum Europe event once more. I just hoped it was in Belgium. It was in Brussels, because that would be my second only visit to Brussels, but maybe in June we can all meet there for the next event about spectrum. If we can go to the second slide, please. I'm here to talk about the new bands And for us, new bands, you have to talk about various things, right? At the GSMA, we've always separated this in sub 1 gigahertz spectrum, and then mid bands and capacity bands, and they are not comparable. And that's the first thing that we need to say. We cannot compare what goes in sub 1 gigahertz with mid bands, with capacity bands. They serve different purposes. They have different propagation characteristics, and you cannot exchange those bands. You cannot simply replace one by the other and have the same level of service or the same characteristics that you would have otherwise. For the sub 1 gigahertz, I think the emphasis of this of the next cycle of the future for 5G is the 470 to 694 in region 1. So I think Europe is going to be in the middle of it, but also, as others said, Middle East and Africa and the CIS countries as well. And it is a band that we've discussed that several times before. I mean, for those who've been doing that for many years, we see that we talked about that at WRC07, and then we talked about at 12, and then we talk about 15, and it's something that it's coming, and it's always coming. The reason why we haven't really discussed that or decided in region 1 is because at that WRC15 there was a thought that it was too early for most of the region, and it was asked to decide at 23 instead. We do feel now that it's time. We do feel that most of the region is ready for that, and of course, on all the bands we're talking about, it will depend on the incumbent services. We heard today talking about harmonization, global harmonization. We at the GSMA would love to have global harmonization in all the bands we're talking about, but it's not always possible because of the incumbent services, because of the different services that different countries have, the needs for different services, and also, of course, the previous users. So in that case, we see that we're now in time to look at that a bit more, and we believe that excess capacity, additional capacity in that band would give additional capacity to the operators in the region. It's not about coverage, but it's about adding the capacity that the operators would already have with, for example, 700 megahertz. With respect to the mid bands, there are many under consideration at this conference, and I would like to highlight the 3.3 to 3.8, which is in various ways in discussion in region 1, but also loads of decisions being made on the top part about 3.8 to 4.2, and we believe that the future in 5G is looking at that part of the band as well. We see interest by various parts of the world in 4.8, 4.99. It's a complicated band. It has some difficult uses in parts of the band, but it would be really good to see some countries that can use that band to talk about, to be able to use that band if they have that availability, or if they imagine having that availability in the near future. And the 6 gigahertz, which is, I think, the biggest topic of the next conference, and everyone wants to know how best to use the 6 gigahertz band, and the GSMA is definitely interested. We asked our operators, and 90% of our operators worldwide said that's where they see the future of 5G, said that's where they see their expansion. So we're working on it. And for capacity, those decisions were made at WRC 19, but it's important for us to guarantee that it's possible to use those bands. It's possible to use. We're following these studies in CPT and in ITU as well, remaining studies with interest. If we go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight here the 3.5 gigahertz. I think for the 3.5 gigahertz, Europe was actually a visionary. In WRC07, for those who were at WRC07, we were discussing extensively that band, and Europe had a position very strong from 3.4 to 3.8. Unfortunately, the rest of the world was not ready to see that. But if we look today, that's what happened. Even in 2015, when discussed that band again, and Europe said, look, we already did that in 06. It is the future. Lots of regions, lots of parts of the world were not ready to look. But if you go to the next slide, you see that's what they're doing. So that's the usage that we have, or the intended usage by various countries from 0 to 500 megahertz or more in the C band, in the 3.5 gigahertz band. And we see that's the reason. So what we would like to say is that even if for those countries who were not there yet, in the 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz band, we see that a movement that is started before 07, but it continues, and we are going to see that usage growing in various parts of the world. If we go to the next slide, we're going to address a bit this the 6 gigahertz band. The GSMA did with Coleago a study that was launched in December for additional spectrum in the mid-band. So it's looking at how much spectrum do the operators need to comply with the vision, the IMT 2020 vision. And they calculated that it's around 2 to 3 gigahertz in mid-band spectrum. If you consider that's around 1 gigahertz currently being used, and look, in that study, we consider that all that 1 gigahertz was going to be used for 5G. We're not considering 2G, 3G, 4G. We're considering that everything goes to 5G. So looking at that, everything goes into 5G, there would be an additional need of 1 to 2 gigahertz in mid-band spectrum. And that's to comply with the IMT vision. This is with the ITU vision. This is not something we have designed or we believe that is the case. We believe that 80 to 100 megahertz of contiguous spectrum per operator is what the technology needs, is what the technology was made for. Can you do service with less than that? Yes, you can. But are you going to be able to provide to all your users? Are you be able to provide the same level of service, the same speeds over time? So this is something that you can start now, but in time, that can start to become a bit complicated. So what we're looking in this study is not what is today, what's the need for today for 5G. They studied what's the need for 2030. So in 2025 to 2030 timeframe. And that's what we found, 1 to 2 gigahertz of additional spectrum. So if you go to the next slide, how do we see that in the 6 gigahertz? If you need 1 to 2 gigahertz of additional spectrum, where's that spectrum going to come from? We already accounted for 3.4 to 3.8. We already accounted for the lower band spectrum that you have between 1 and 3 gigahertz. So where can additional spectrum come from? It can come from 3.8 to 4.2. It can come from 4.8, 4.99, or it can come from 6 gigahertz. But there is a limitation of what spectrum could be potentially used for IMT between 1 and 8 gigahertz, for example. So this is our message today. We believe that it's really important that we talk about the future band, the additional needs for mid-band, for IMT spectrum. It's not something that we did at WRC 15. And for the first time at WRC 23, we're going to address the 5G mid-band spectrum. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting, and we'll all have to read that study and understand that 2 to 3 gigahertz or 1 to 3 and whatnot. So yes, let's bring up the whole panel and we'll open up the floor to questions. We have 3 that have come in, and I think I had a few themes in mind, and actually these do capture most of it. So let me, why don't we do them 1, 2, 3 and see where we land on some of the related issues. So question 1 is directed from Ericsson to Eric Fournier. So I don't know if there's something we should read into that, but it just says, can you talk a little bit about low band spectrum? But let me just, and UHF. So I guess, Lars mentioned a lot about that. And but Eric, one of the things that maybe just as a contextual point around that, I'm not sure exactly what they say, talk a little bit about it. I'm sure you could talk for a long time about it. But when I looked at the ANFR clearance plan of 700 a few years ago, and I'm just going by memory here, but one of the things that leapt off the page to me was that when you clear the 700, you kind of inadvertently or kind of by doing it also clear some of the 600 because some of the blocks effectively move down further. Is that a first step to the further clearance, or what are the issues around that? Or if people are doing the GEO6, if they haven't done it yet, can they basically do it all at once? I mean, I don't know if that's the reason for that, but Eric, maybe you have some other insight into UHF that they're poking at there.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Yeah, there's 2 options for the UHF band. Either you think in terms of new slice of digital dividend, and then you have to do exactly what happened for the 700 megahertz or the 800 megahertz. But in this case, the difficulty is that you have to have something which is unified at the EU level. We started in 2015 to do the job, like Germany, and it took something like 4 or 5 years to do it at the European level. But basically, everybody needs to move in the same time frame, and that's making things difficult because now we are at a point where, okay, broadcasting has a priority until 2030. It's in the law in France until the end of 2030. Very likely there will be still in some countries like France a big need for broadcasting in this frequency band. So it will be very difficult to have something decided at the EU level which will enable to progress as just one continent, just one set of countries. And the second option is having something which is like 5G broadcast, which is downlink only. Then in this case, it's making things much easier, because you could have some implementation in France and in Germany, which could be in different time frame, and we could ensure some kind of compatibility. But at the same time, it's something where 5G broadcast, the demand for that is not yet completely demonstrated. So that's really the difficulty we have to face in the UHF band, and I hope I responded to the question.
Okay, no, that's excellent. I guess we should probably open up a bit of that question to some of the other panelists. I think the UHF, obviously we could talk about UHF all day, but one of the things that I think Lars mentioned, and I think it relates to something Mohammed said too, but in the UHF context, you know, during last year was a very unique situation, right, with COVID, and you know, a number of our clients had difficulty dealing with that, and the FCC, you know, they issued new spectrum. The UK got some temporary, you know, the temporary spectrum authorizations all over the place. So Lars, you mentioned, you know, the increase in viewership on DTT, you know, during the COVID period, which is not surprising, but there was also quite an increased use of mobile and telecom services, you know, for much the same reasons. I guess, does that context maybe evolve a bit the view of the role of UHF going forward? You know, in other words, the need for spectrum, and to Mohammed's point about oversupply, you know, clearly there wasn't if you had to have temporary spectrum authorization. Lars, do you want to start on that? This guy's sort of UHF contextual question, I guess.
Yeah, I think Lars could respond to that.
Well, he's not responding yet, so.
I want a bit. There's a lot of echo when you speak, so could you put the question a bit straightforward, clear?
Just, you know, segueing a bit from the UHF discussion.
Yeah.
You know, and in the context of COVID, you mentioned the increased viewership on CT, right? So there's also very much increased usage on mobile and on terrestrial telecom and other things. Does that evolve so when we look at, you know, supply and demand, and UHF is only 2% and things like that, those kind of overlays the demand, the COVID over demand, is it likely to continue, and therefore perhaps evolve the view a little bit on the question of the demand and supply, you know, equation there?
Well, what we see, of course, there has been more demand during the COVID crisis on all platforms, basically, but more than we expected on linear television. So people are actually watching TV, perhaps depending on that they're at home and cannot do anything else. I don't know. Right. But basically, obviously, the broadcast platforms are used by some half of the European population. And when we see statistics, it's 3.5 hours per day per pop, which is quite impressive. And what we hear is, of course, that people are saying it's going down. Yes, it's going down, but very slowly. So there is no dramatic, change in use of the platform. It may change in the future. We don't know that. But still, as we see it, obviously, it will remain for a long time. But we have quite an open mind to look at what 5G broadcast could offer. And within the broadcast community, there's a lot of work going on, and experiments and initiatives to look at this technology. But what we think basically is, as Eric says, if there is a downlink only provision in the sub-700 megahertz band, it could be quite easy for countries which want to retain DTT. I mean, some of the countries like Italy, Spain, France, UK have a very high penetration of DTT. Some others like Switzerland, Belgium, very small. So there could be compatibility. Some could do 5G broadcasts. Some could do other downlink services. Some could retain DTT, but that is provisional of that we have a downlink only provision. So I don't know if that answers the question, but a little bit at least.
Let's find some good context. Okay, no, that makes sense. But Mohammed, how does that change your view, or does it change your view on the demand-supply equation? I guess in light of perhaps UHF, but other bands as well, with the COVID situation. We just saw Verizon buying 170 megahertz contiguous spectrum. Does any of that change your views on this before we segue to the next question?
Sure. I mean, I'm not in much involved in the UHF spectrum, but as a principle, I think I'm speaking as an industry representative. But I think it's really up to the regulators to make the ultimate decisions. And if I was in the regulators' shoes, I would think, what is the objectives for me? Number one is obviously to make sure that we provide the connectivity to the citizens in order to make sure everybody's connected. And number two is, of course, there's a revenue element. Nobody can deny with auctions there is a revenue element. So if you look at the first element, the first principle, I think we need to have a reality check. Do we really need more spectrum, particularly now with the demand, because we're actually with COVID and the pandemic? It's a real good example because everybody's indoors, everybody's remotely working, so there should be a surge in demand on the infrastructure. I think that's been met by the current fiber rollout and the connectivity of Wi-Fi in the indoor connectivity. So there is that element that is already being met. If you look at the other principle, which is the revenue, as I tried to explain in my slides, I believe that there is a risk of oversupplying spectrum, and this tends to lead to lower revenue rather than maximizing the revenue. So regulators need to balance these challenges. I'm sure as an industry, we'll have different viewpoints, but it's ultimately the regulators that have to make these decisions.
Okay, makes sense. I guess we could certainly debate that point. Let me go to the third question, come back to the second one, because it does relate to that, and I'd like to get back to Luciana and Branimir as well. But so the third comment or question kind of, to me, relates a bit. It says a comment from Huawei basically says, over-reliance on carrier aggregation has implications with regards to reduced spectral efficiency. I think Mohammed mentioned carrier aggregation as well. And importantly, on power consumption, both at the base station and the handset, and in terms of implications vis-a-vis environmental aspects. I think those are valid points. The other thing with carrier aggregation, though, and we just come back to Luciana on this point, if we need a lot of spectrum, and we say we're going to use carrier aggregation, for those non-technical people, a carrier means a radio, right? It's a box. It sits on a site. If I have carrier aggregation, if I have two bands, it means I have two of them. So to me, there's also an economics equation of using carrier aggregation. So aren't you better to have large swaths of spectrum for the technical reason that Huawei is saying, but also just for economic reasons, as opposed to saying, well, I have a bit here and a bit there, and I can carrier aggregate it? I know, Luciana, do you have an industry view on that? Maybe to start.
Sure. Well, I think that carrier aggregation is nothing new. It's being treated in this panel as if it's, let's invent carrier aggregation, and it's a great idea. The truth is that we have been using carrier aggregation for as long as I remember. How many bands do we have in operation, mobile operators already use? And that is a fact. But on top of using carrier aggregation, on top of using all the facilities that are there for the operators, we also see that there's been an absurd increase in demand. And with that absurd increase in demand, there will be a demand in spectrum. And how best to address the demand in spectrum, considering the pool of frequencies that the operators have to be able to provide services to the consumers. So I think we all need to address all these elements to have the right answer. The other thing I wanted to mention is that just create the auctions, creating revenue to the regulators is something that brings lots of problems. It brings increase in prices, for example, and we do believe it's not the best way to discuss that. But I'll leave that to a different panel. That's a very different topic. I just wanted to address because it was addressed quickly in this panel. Thank you.
We could talk all day about that point too. And So that's interesting. And certainly carrier aggregation has been around for a long time, but the 5G with the large swaths, I guess, brings us a bit maybe back to the second question. So let's segue into that, and maybe I'll give Branimir a chance to pipe in on this one. But so Ira's presentation earlier, which was a very good rundown of all the activities in the US. One of the things he talked about was the spectrum horizons above 95 gigahertz. I guess what does the panel think of the spectrum bands in this range, and will they play a part in connectivity for 6G? And I guess I would add to that, as a subtlety, Branimir, for your point of view, is 6G just a question of bands, or are there other technologies we're talking about there?
Yes, thank you. I think 6G is first a question of use cases, so we should know where we are going and what the next step requirements will be. It is really too early to talk about all that. There is already some vision developed. We're talking about the Internet of Senses, joint communications and sensing. about the continuation of tactile communications, machine-type communications will be very on the move, ubiquitous connectivity, etc. There are quite different directions taken when we're talking about this vision. For me, it is not clear yet what will be really the use cases there. And this will determine, of course, spectrum demand. In 5G, we took this approach that of a spectrum mix. We identified there will be very high bandwidth, high speed use cases, which should be covered by millimeter wave bands, and refarming of lower bands will help to ensure coverage. This may be also the case with 6G. But if we look at this spectrum range above 100 gigahertz, of course, this is for us new area where there are some important services. There are passive services in some bands. Sharing could be quite challenging. It depends on which band we're looking at. These are all things which I think first should a bit come from the research side, from the experimentation which some countries have already undertook, and the US is one such case.
That makes sense. Anyone else want to comment on the 6G bands? I think that's really an interesting technology development there up in those frequencies, and there's a lot of capacity, so maybe that goes to the increased usage case as well. But if not, we're going to go a few minutes over the allocated time. We were supposed to end at 4:15. I think the organizers give us an extra 10 minutes, so we can continue on with our questions. Some of them are a bit involved, so I'll read the question, and I'm not sure if anyone has a quick comment on it, but it's something that could take a fair amount of time to actually answer. One of the Gigabit Society's, and this is from PTS in Sweden, someone asked, one of the Gigabit Society's strategic objectives for 2025 is access to connectivity of at least 100 megabits for all European households. Actually, I guess that was an objective from a while ago, as I recall that one. This capacity is enough for TV services. Okay, satellite is also a viable option to provide TV services. Broadcast TV is a highly demanded service, but the distribution does not need to be via terrestrial transmission, considering the gigabit objective. Should the EC reconsider its 2030 position on UHF? I don't know if we want to spend too much time on that. So I want to have a quick comment on that. That's a complicated question.
Could I start?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, I think this was also related to one of the previous questions. I think that currently we have a sort of good legal certainty in the European Union regarding use of the sub-700 band and the UHF spectrum as a whole. We have also a degree of flexibility. So if there is a move in this band from, let's say, broadcasting to more mobile services, depending on national needs, this could be done in a downlink-only manner. This is what the framework allows. This will much depend also on the specific national situations. We have recognized already in the past with the LAMI process the quite big variety of demand for broadcasting services across the Union. And I think we don't really need to revisit much our regulation, our legal situation in place. And it gives us some certainty independent of the outcome of WRC 23. What is important here is probably to stimulate innovation also on the broadcasting side. We have been talking enough about broadcasting being a 5G vertical, and there are developments with 5G broadcast in this direction. Move to 5G from the broadcasting sector will give them also the opportunity to better share this spectrum, to probably develop new business models towards more convergence with wireless broadband services. And I will also bring the topic of spectrum sharing in this regard. I think that this band overall could be also a good candidate for more advanced spectrum sharing in the future also in Europe. And I think this is quite in the context of the current RSPG draft opinion on spectrum sharing, which I would advise all to comment on, because I think it provides a pretty strong position on spectrum sharing as a way forward, and also incorporating, or let's say urging member states to cooperate more strongly on that topic.
Okay, makes sense. There's another theme I'd like to get to. We'll see if we have time, but there's a question that relates a bit to the sharing point, I think, so that's a good segue from what you were just saying. So the question, and it's written in a negative sense, so we'll read into it a little bit, but what would be the consequence if more mid-band and low-band spectrum cannot be made available for 5G on an exclusive basis? So I guess the consequences, I guess I say it's written in a negative way, but I guess it's implying that if there's shared bands, is that somehow taking away from 5G, or are there other sharing mechanisms that can be more supportive of 5G? Who wants to start with that? Eric, maybe. Do you have a view on that from RSPG or from France?
We will certainly find some solutions. The difficulty is only to decide on which level of sharing burden, for example, we will have to make available a certain spectrum, and what would be any potential cost of refarming the frequency band. But there will be some solutions. I mean, we have seen also the FCC presentation, the Saudi Arabia presentation. There's a kind of international race and a kind of say benchmarking, and there's no reason why Europe would have situations which would be significantly different from other regions. The only point is that frequency band may sometimes depend. It's a pity, but the initial situation is different, so sometimes the result is different. But in terms of amount of frequency, we will certainly succeed in finding some needed frequency.
But do the sharing, I guess, or does anyone else want to pipe in on that? I guess the sharing mechanisms versus dedicated spectrum, does that have an impact on what's available? Does anyone else want to pipe in on that? Maybe Luciana or you?
I can, yes, thank you. I think that well, in an ideal world, and that what our operators would like is availability to exclusive use of spectrum, and that is for many reasons. We see that's what has been done in the past. We see that what has worked in the past, while we see that the sharing mechanisms that we have seen in the past have not really worked very well. So I think we are in a situation now that we'll have to investigate new things, and some of them might work and some of them might not work. What are the consequences? That is on the question of if that spectrum is not made available on an exclusive basis. Well, if you don't get the details right, the consequence is that the service delivered to the consumers will suffer, and that is simply a very, very simple solution, response to that question. So I think we need to get those discussions correct. We need to try to get those answers. But as a principle, we would definitely prefer access to spectrum on an exclusive basis. Noting that no one pays to spectrum as much as we do.
Yeah.
I would like to point out.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Excellent points. And I guess, you made the very good point earlier that each of the ranges are different. I like to always say that each band has its own story, and they're definitely not all the same. So that kind of segues us a bit to another question in a slightly different area. We only have a few minutes left, and it's a bit of a complicated topic as well, but to get into refarming. So someone from Sky, Martin Lee, asked, given that 5G is much more efficient than its predecessors, arguably true, and the mobile handset life cycle is typically quoted as 2-3 years, isn't it time for refarming of IMT to be taken more seriously rather than constantly demanding broadcasters move out? So I think that's certainly an interesting question. And my original band chart, clearly you take the 3G band becomes 5G, some of the 4G bands. Who wants to chime in first on that? Maybe Hannah, go ahead then.
Thank you. I saw Lars's hand as well. Sorry. I'll just quickly mention that I mentioned this in my in opening remarks as well. I believe that this is an excellent point because it's very overlooked currently today. We all agree that spectrum is a rare resource. We need to efficiently use it. I think refarming existing spectrum is a very cost-effective way. China is actually looking at this very seriously as well, where they're looking at refarming 2G and 3G spectrum. And with TDD technology, it is possible to do that. So I certainly welcome that. And I think the upside of this is you're actually efficiently using the spectrum, but also not impacting incumbent services that are actually using spectrum that's available to them today.
Okay, makes sense. Lars, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, well, of course, we've also been a little bit surprised about the band plans in 7, 8, and 900 megahertz. If you look at them, they're certainly not optimal. And looking at the broadcast sector, I mean, we've been refarming and increasing services with less spectrum several times now. So I think it's obviously a good idea to have a look at other sectors as well, and just not demand more and more and more, because there are some technical tricks you can do to actually use the spectrum you have better.
Sure. Yeah, okay, makes sense. Luciana, you want to add to that? You on mute?
I am. Sorry about that. Thank you very much.
You're on mute. You know,
I think those two elements that were mentioned here were different. Refarming 2G and 3G and 4G into 5G, this is something that we're looking at, and this is something that is considered in this study as I have presented earlier. This is not a mystery to us. Refarming, how the spectrum is used in different band plans, is a much, much bigger question. So we need to go, for example, to the ITU, we need to go to the regional groups. There is a reason why the band plans are they are today. Do we think that there are ways, or it would be good for us to use the entirety of 694 to 960? Yes, it would be great. Thank you very much. But there are other users to be considered. So it's not such a simple question that we just say, let's refarm it all and leave the broadcasters alone. We're trying to address the scarcity of the spectrum, and we're trying to address all the users that need to use the spectrum and how best to provide value to the consumer. So I think the question is a lot more complicated than it seems presented here. Thank you.
No, totally agree. A lot of complex issues. Eric, did you want to wrap us up on this point? Or? Eric.
Oh yeah, sorry.
We have about 1 minute, so I don't know if you want to.
No, okay. I was in agreement with Lucian as the grand plan refarming that doesn't work because you have a lot of other usage. Also, 1 point, spectrum efficiency in 5G, it's much better than 4G when you have active antenna and when you are in higher spectrum in mid-band. But below 1 GHz, you don't have so big difference between 4G and 5G spectrum efficiency.
All right, Branimir, last word on refarming and bands.
Yeah, really very briefly, I think I already pointed out in my presentation that we are really rushing to make all harmonized spectrum fit for 5G. I think this exercise will be by the end of this year finished, and it is then up to operators basically to refarm the spectrum, the existing rights, and to phase out technologies in order to allow the further deployment of 5G. And we see already a trend of 3G phase out. I think this is already running in some member states. And yeah, I think we are moving along this quite well.
Excellent. Well, on that word, I think we'll have to close the session because Dan wants to get to his beer and move on to the closing ceremony. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'll pass it back over to Dan.
Rob, thank you very much, and I'd like to echo Rob's thanks, to all of the panelists as well. So another fascinating discussion. So thank you all very much for that, and yeah, I'm sure some key bands and key issues there that are going to be hot on the agenda for a number of years to come. So thank you all so much for that. Really appreciate it, and a great way to wrap up the formal sessions from this year's conference. So thank you all very much indeed. So as I said, that is the end of the formal sessions we have at the conference, but please don't go anywhere because we're now going to be switching straight to our closing ceremony. So if you wait where you are, we'll be back with you in just about 30 seconds for our closing ceremony. So welcome back, everybody. And as I said, we are now here with our closing ceremony, where we're going to be hearing from a number of key stakeholders, and we're also going to be asking all of you out there on what your key conclusions are from the conference. So get ready to give us your thoughts. We want to invite you to put those in the chat on the right-hand side of the screen. And we want this session to be a little bit more informal, maybe, than the rest of the event. So if you've got any, I know it's maybe a bit early for some of you, depending on where you're watching, but if you want to go and grab yourself a drink now and make yourself comfortable, and now's the time to do that. And we're going to talk over some of the outcomes, some of the takeaways, and some of the conclusions we've got from the event. So please feel free to go and do that now. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be in around about 20 minutes or so be joined by some guests, the SweetBeats, who are going to be playing some music for us, some live music, and closing the event. So it's been a bit of a tradition at this conference over the last few years for the networking reception to be hosted by EWIA, the European Wireless Infrastructure Association. And we're hugely grateful to EWIA that they've actually continued this trend in the virtual environment this year and are once again hosting this reception. And whilst it's a little bit more difficult than normal for them to maybe provide drinks and canapes for all of us, we have sent out drinks to our speakers and panelists on their behalf. So for all of you who have been speaking at the event, hopefully you've received your drinks. I know that there has been a few slight delays in those going out, which are possibly down to teething problems with what the UK government are saying with Brexit. So apologies if you haven't yet received your drinks, but I think most of you have. But if not, they'll be on their way shortly. But if you have received it, it's now time to get that open. And with that, I would like to then introduce to the stage a representative from our host for this evening. So I'd like to welcome a familiar face to everybody, Jean-Pierre Faison from EWIA. So Jean-Pierre, welcome to the stage. And as I said, we really are grateful to you and to all of your colleagues at EWIA for your support of the event and particularly of this reception once again this year. And I'd like to maybe pass over now to yourself to give us some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Dan. And good afternoon and welcome to everyone for this closing reception. And on behalf of EWIA, the European Wireless Infrastructure Association, our 10 members present in 14 European countries invest and operate in wireless infrastructure that is typically towers and rooftops, but also and increasingly with the 5G era, fiber-connected small cells, distributed antenna systems, or edge computing. As a takeaway from this conference, I would like to use the analogy of what we call auberge espagnole, Spanish hotel, and somehow, because it's a French expression, also potluck. That is some kind of a dinner party where everybody brings some food, and at the end we have a great party. And clearly for this 5G conference, I think we've seen many actors, and it's beyond the conference, of course, for this 5G project. We have many actors bringing, whether there are regulators, whether there are policymakers, whether there are manufacturers, operators, customers, users, investors. They're all bringing leadership, ideas, skill, technology, know-how, finance, and somehow we're all looking for a great project and party. What are EWIA members bringing to the party? We're bringing three things. Our members bring their site portfolio, which is continuously expanding, especially in order to reduce the digital divide. They're bringing quick and open access to any wireless network operator who wants to somehow use their infrastructure. And they're bringing financing, that is the capability through their own cash generation or by their access to capital resources to bring in money from different sources than the usual telecom investment. And of course, with these three advantages, you would think that's pretty compelling, and it is in reality. The independent outsourcing model is the prevailing one in most continents outside of Europe. In Europe, it is emerging, but right now the market share is about 20%. It is rapidly growing. And I'm very confident after the few deals which have been announced at the beginning of 2021 that next year we'll be able to report an even increased market share. Coming back as a conclusion to this analogy of the auberge espagnole, maybe some of you know this movie, Auberge Espagnole, Spanish hotel, potluck depending on the country, which is emblematic somehow of Europe. And I think in this movie, for those who've seen, we have a bunch of Erasmus students, how symbolic of Europe, who somehow go to Barcelona for their completion of their studies and for somehow the coming of the beginning of their adult life. And I think somehow we are at the same threshold as a sector, I would say. I think collectively we are here for a common project that is 5G and enhancing Europe's connectivity. And we are at the beginning of what the Commission has called the digital decade. So I think we have really a future to build together. And for that, I think the same community that we found in the movie, I think we also need to find it even in these times of social distancing. And it's good that conferences such as the one organized by Forum Europe bring in social closeness also. And I'm very happy that this ceremony, in addition to the great takeaways that will be given by all the people who will speak, I think it also will bring us some part of this social closeness. So thank you very much. Enjoy the end of this conference. Good luck.
Jean-Pierre, thank you so much. And yeah, once again, really do appreciate you hosting the reception here. And I think I can probably speak on behalf of all of us and yourself as well, I'm sure, when we say let's all really hope that we can all meet up in person and share a drink actually with each other rather than just from behind a computer screen next time. But in the meantime, cheers. Thank you so much. And yeah, really appreciate, as I said, your support of the reception. Thank you. So we now are going to be listening to a number of, we now have a number of stakeholders with us who are going to be giving us some of their conclusions, their key takeaways from the conference. I think we have around about 20 minutes for this now, 25 minutes. So we have, I think, 5 or 6 people who are going to give us some conclusions. So we'd ask them to keep them relatively brief, relatively high level. But I'm going to pass over now to Amit. And welcome Amit to the stage, who's going to be introducing the speakers here. So Amit, over to you. So I think you have the tough job of maybe trying to keep people relatively brief with the conclusions, but also maybe getting a bit of a discussion going if we can. But we have around about 20 or 25 minutes in total, so I'll leave it in your capable hands. But I'll start welcoming everyone else to the stage now, and then I'll leave it to you to introduce the speakers to give their remarks.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. And just as we bring everybody up, I mean, I just want to say congratulations to everybody for a very successful conference. Congratulations to all the speakers and presenters and the audience for their participation, and of course to the whole Forum Europe team for a very well-run conference. I mean, I've certainly found it very interesting. I mean, I think I sort of detect 2 big things that have changed from last year. First of all, I think the conference very much, has traditionally focused on sort of technology and spectrum issues. And it was very interesting to see this year, there was a lot more, it sort of widened out a lot more. We talked about security issues, we talked about environmental sustainability a lot more, and a lot of discussion about funding. I think money's been a constant theme throughout many sessions of the conference. And secondly, I think, thinking back a year, or thinking back over the other conferences over the last year, it's almost been a sort of, oh gosh, we're in COVID and what's COVID meant and so on. This was very much forward-looking, the digital decade and the likes. And I think that was very positive. We're all starting to look at what's ahead of us rather than sort of stuck in this COVID nightmare. So I think that's really, really good news. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the conference. As Dan mentioned, we have initially 6 speakers just to give their sort of views on the conference, their own thoughts. And as Dan requested, we are pretty short of time, so please do stick to sort of 2 to 3 minutes, because it's not fair to obviously people coming later on. So let's do that. So first up is Joanne LeMay from EWIA. Over to you, Joanne. What did you think?
Well, first of all, Amit, I'd say thank you for a good introduction, and to Forum Europe for a great conference. And certainly, I do hope that next time we can be in person. I'm not sure it's going to be in June, but we hope so. So if I go to my thoughts on the conference, I'm left a little bit uneasy about the questions or the matter of network sharing, which was discussed this morning. And I know it was discussed yesterday, for example, on the environmental panel, is that network sharing helps to reduce the environmental footprint of 5G and is a benefit. But during our session this morning, there was a lot of talk. Regulators push for network sharing. They like it. They have different ways. I mean, you can invent as many ways as you can. But I think that a lot of the carriers have a very different view of sharing. And as I would say, evidenced by the results of partly by the results of the FCC auction, which shows that the carrier was willing to pay so much money for a very large swath of contiguous exclusive spectrum as opposed to shared spectrum. So I think that there's some issue there. I mean, although I find from my perspective, network sharing is interesting, but I'm beginning to wonder what impact it could have on investment levels and on the success of 5G and bringing innovation, because regulators see this as a way to bring innovation. And I think that's not a sure thing for me. So that is one thing that I take from the conference on network sharing. The other thing is lack, I would say, continued lack of really strong interest for millimeter wave in the EU, where there doesn't seem to be too many carriers or too many of the participants that see this before 2023 or even 2026, or in some cases never. And again, here we don't have a lot of exclusive licensing. We're having applications and all that. So I'm beginning to wonder what that could mean for the future of millimeter wave in the EU. And so that's my second thought. And my third thought is that we're going to still be talking a lot about low band and UHF for the next couple of years, I think, a renewed interest. I won't go any further than that. I know we have other panelists that may chime in on this, but I think that's still an issue, pending issue that will be discussed quite a bit at the next radio conference. And the lines are drawn. They've been for a while, but they were a little bit subdued, but now they're coming back to the next conference. So that's a little bit my take from the conference. And I think, as you mentioned, there's a lot of talk about applications and the benefits of 5G, and I hope that actually can be realized with the frameworks that we have right now. So,
great, thanks so much, Joanne. I mean, on that third topic, that's a great introduction to our next speaker, Lars Buckland from Broadcast Networks Europe, and I guess you'll pick up on the third point about the UHF spectrum, but hopefully talk more widely as well about what you thought about the conference.
Yeah, of course. Being representing the terrestrial network operators, the sub-700 UHF band is of course a primary and very high interest for us. I think yes, today the media sector and broadcast sector is using the sub-700 for DTT, and we do have an open mind for what 5G broadcast could bring, but we still think that broadcast service will be quite important for a long time. So we think that the sub-700 should be used for downlink only services and media distribution. And this is actually a fairly critical item because there is no other spectrum available for terrestrial distribution. And it's not a technical issue only, it's rather a political issue. It has to do with culture, it has to do with content production, it has to do with public service in Europe. And it's a fairly sensitive thing to just ask, as GSMA does, we want the sub-700 spectrum, period. We think that is a fairly dangerous position to take. So we hope and we think that the discussions before the WRC 23 will actually be constructive and also recognize that there are other uses than IMT, and the media sector might have a good cause to retain the 470 to 694. Having said that, we also think that 5G broadcast will have a role in the future, and we have an open mind to look at that.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, on to Artie Holler from the EMEA Satellite Operators Association. Over to you for your thoughts on the conference.
Thank you, Amit. Yeah, congrats and thank you to Forum Europe for another excellent event. It's really great to have seen issues and questions around satellite raised across a number of different sessions over the last couple of days. I do have the sense that the importance of satellite in 5G is starting to be better understood and appreciated. And indeed, as we, at association level, we learn more about the partnerships that the satellite operators are fostering with different players, whether it's cloud companies or MNOs or chipset manufacturers, we realize to what extent satellite's not just about extending 5G services, but actually about making sure that they can happen and that the business case can close. We did a showcase today, and I know that the role of satellites for connected and autonomous vehicles, besides GPS, was always in question. And I think it's clearer now that if, for example, insurers can't count on critical data going directly from vehicles, no matter where they are, then autonomous vehicles, for example, won't be allowed on roads. Another important point that was made in the last couple of days is that while 3GPP Release 17 is obviously going to produce important specs for new radio, for NB-IoT, and possibly even 5G backhaul over NTN, and obviously that's going to support economies of scale. Satellite operators and their non-satellite partners are already finding ways of enabling 5G apps before that happens, using existing systems and just adjusting or compensating for certain elements where that's necessary. And that's also really important to support the 5G ecosystem and its ambitions overall. So satellite's definitely here to stay as part of the 5G era. I think the Commission affirmed that, and that's great. And just two last comments, one on spectrum. We've heard that there's a lot of 5G spectrum available for IMT. Millimeter wave band, as Joanne said, is there, even if there's no strong demand for it yet. Remains to be seen if all of the C-band 400 megahertz will actually be used. And real rollouts by MNOs in Europe show that carrier aggregation is already there. So a strong pushback on the argument about MNOs needing at least 80 megahertz of contiguous spectrum. And of course, the question of increasing Wi-Fi offload. But for me, I think the most important takeaway is the need to come back to reality and reset so that all citizens can benefit from what I called meaningful connectivity. And I noted in particular one of the polls that said that societal aspects like inclusion should be at the heart of the review of the 5G Action Plan, the RSPP, and so on. And I think that's such an important message for the Commission and regulators to heed. And in this event, yes, it's all about 5G, but we're already hearing vendors talk a lot about 6G. And if we're not careful, that could distort policymaking and be used as the next argument to secure even more spectrum for one sector, when in reality, every sector is vital and they need investment certainty and policy support. So let's dream our vision, but keep our heads on our shoulders for policymaking with users at the center. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Artie. Okay, let's get another perspective. So can I introduce Hui Kao from Huawei and give us your thoughts on the conference, please?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, congratulations to Forum Europe for this successful event. There were many valuable and fruitful discussions within the past 3 days, which made all of us think deeply about how to make the most efforts of 5G, and then to think about how 5G could bring a better future and a life for our society. Obviously, we see, currently global-wide, about 1 million 5G site has been built. Europe has to be quickly catch up in terms of the connectivities. So there were many barriers that have been discussed during past 3 days. For example, the spectrum issues, EMF, and also sustainability, aspects. So those have been handled properly. And also, more importantly, we see the 5G innovation, the digital innovation come from the 5G, how to make more industry, the vertical sector can benefit from the 5G. So that will be crucial, because without let more sector to benefit 5G, then the business model, the business case will cause a significant pullback. So which cause the more issues in terms of 5G connectivities, and also come to the future beyond 5G. We see there were many potential ways has been discussed. Again, we think this long-term approach, technical approach, should be handled start from now, but that's supposed not, to bring any potential issues to for the 5G connectivities, and the unitary global standard for the long-term future of the next generation wireless technology, particularly for 6G, that still become a critical and important factor for Europe to play the most important role. And also so we urge the policymakers to continuously support the setting of the global unitary standard for 6G, and the unitary standard reduce the cost, like many sectors are benefit from some such a kind of global standard. And also that will promote both business efficiency and innovation activities. And more importantly, we see the ongoing Horizon Europe will be an important vehicle that can be used in a global context to push for a global unitary standard for 6G, which could come on stream as early as 2028. But meanwhile, this still a very challenging year for next couple of years, how to make sure 5G will come to us as soon as possible. Within, if we think about the next 5G conference, then what kind of updates Europe could bring, to the global, let's say, 5G campaign, and also how many coverage the European operators could support to deliver. So all those questions requires a joint effort by the whole ecosystem together. So again, thanks again for Forum Europe.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, just moving on to Cecile Emile from SES. Give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Hamid. I'd like to thank Dan, of course, for this very good conference, but I would like also to thank Jean-Pierre for this reception. I don't have any drink, but I actually have a mango yogurt, which I will eat, thinking about all the wonderful drinks we should normally have together if we were in real life. In fact, 5G is a little bit like this yogurt, I can think about 4 layers which are a kind of wrap up of this event. Well, first of all, there is the consumer layer. And I think we tend to forget. We tend to forget to wonder what it is for that we are doing. I know we talk about being top high level connectivity, and we think a lot about industry, and we want to compete with the rest of the world. But one essential critical element is to wonder whether the people, the citizens in Europe, are happy about what we are offering to them. So the question is 100 megabits per second enough? Is it really available everywhere? How can we actually provide the meaningful connectivity which Artie was referring to? The second layer is about technology, and I'm so pleased to hear that CITC, Mohammed, in his presentation said, no dominant technology. I think this is clearer than ever. We heard it from different people. Guillaume also made that point very clear. Wi-Fi, MNOs, verticals. I mean, all technologies have to contribute to the 5G ecosystem. FWA possibly. Let's see what we can do with that. So it goes besides and beyond IMT, if I may say. The third layer is really about the network characteristics. We're talking about 5G. Well, actually, satellites is already being integrated in 5G now, because we're getting into the cloud. We actually enable what is called edge compute. We made that presentation, that showcase today about it. We made it possible thanks to all the work that was undertaken in the 5G PPP in Brussels. And we also, have all the elements of being cyber secure. We have that particular ability of being secure by design. This is really one of our main characteristics. The last point is obviously spectrum. This conference is not all about spectrum. But spectrum is essential. It is our blood. And one obvious way of being innovative with spectrum is doing more with less. This is what the DTT representative said, and I think that's a very important point. It's not only about sharing, and sometimes sharing is too difficult for the regulators, notably, but it's about doing more with less. Thank you, Amit.
Great, thank you, Cecile. Okay, finally, let's go to Guillaume Lebrun, please, from Facebook.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Forum Europe, and thank you, Jean-Pierre, for the reception. As you can see, the sun is out in Munich, so I feel like I'm on stage under a spotlight. That's my way to do virtual reality with you guys and really feel like we are in a normal conference. But going back to my takeaway from the conference, Amit, you really stole my thunder. It was refreshing, exciting, inspiring to see that people are projecting towards the future and starting to look at new things. I mean, when you look at 5G, of course, we identify there's need for investment, for especially in rural area. We need to find more on local connectivity, spectrum for airline. We probably need to find something for Wi-Fi 7, but in general, we're getting there. It sounds like, I think we've all done a great job over the past few years. But clearly, it was fantastic to see people talk about 6G, talk about satellite, talk about Wi-Fi 8, and turn towards 2030. So I think the first takeout is that Dan's got to change the name of the conference for next year, and next year we'll all be coming to the Digital Decade Conference, and that's going to be super exciting. And the other thing that I found very interesting in the poll, in the feedback from the people attending the conference, is that when we were talking about exact solution, technical aspects, sometimes the response were very surprising, like in our session this morning. But yesterday, when we talked about European values, it was very clear about environment, about connectivity. All these aspects are very well understood among all of us. So I think we've got all the elements in place to build something great over the next few years, turns toward 2030, and make sure that we got European connectivity working for us. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Gosh, what a range of comments we've had there. I mean, I daren't actually choose one of the topics for discussion because I think we'll open up a 10-minute session of discussion, and unfortunately we haven't got time for that. So I think what I'm going to do instead is move on to our final speaker, the person that has the final word, if you like, and this is Peter Stuckman from the European Commission. And I think you have the unenviable task of summarizing 3 days of absolutely excellent conference and huge number of debates in just sort of 4 to 5 minutes. So over to you and see what you can do. Thank you.
Wow, that's a nice task. So not 45 minutes, but 4 to 5 minutes, I understand, right? Good. Yeah, indeed, I think you already made a nice summary at the beginning, Amit, so that's nice. I subscribe to that, and I also like the Auberge Espagnole, so that would be also nice to really be very closely together. And we are thinking about Barcelona and hope that we all go to Barcelona soon in June, and that would be, of course, nice. Yeah, but coming back to these very nice 3 days, indeed, I didn't attend all of the sessions, but my colleagues also told me a bit about it. So I heard it was very interesting. Indeed, an impressive program. So we're starting with the 5G policy, talking about targets and investment. As you said, I mean, that's really a nice flavor now that we understood that we have these funding opportunities. It's not that we're shifting from private to public investment, but really unlocking the private investment through the public instruments that we have now. We then moved to 6G. So the technology roadmap, the partnership that is coming up, very exciting and very important. Linking that then to cybersecurity, to societal challenges, and to the regulatory issues, in particular spectrum. So yeah, indeed, the interest is high, things are moving. There's indeed a new context now from the crisis, hopefully very fast to recovery. Action is really needed now, so it's not the time probably to only talk about strategies and targets, even if we of course need this forward-looking approach. There I agree. So action is needed now. We need the investment environment. The investment environment, of course, is not easier than before necessarily, than before the crisis. But for the digital sector, of course, easier than for other sectors, because this somehow got a boost in that sense that there's a strong confirmation that there are opportunities in digital infrastructure that will hopefully help to move forward both on the public and on the private side. So the upcoming digital decade strategy, we want to support that. So of course the horizon will be 2030, but we need to act now on many things. So we want to set this clear path for these investments and the launch of the flagships to happen now in key technology areas, including for 5G. On the societal side, there are also opportunities. Citizens see the advantages now more than before, I think, but there's also fears and skepticism. And especially in the area of 5G, we know that, and this was also discussed. We have to empower every citizen to be part of the digital world. The inclusion aspect is certainly gaining importance now in this context. And there's also a communication element, so talking about things, and especially not only expert talk that we did, of course, here for 3 days, but we also reflecting, of course, in this context, what is important for citizens, what is the message for citizens, how do you benefit, does everyone benefit? And in that context, really take the fears seriously, listen and discuss them and inform. Voila, that's my closing message, and it was really nice to be part of this event again this year, very well organized, and looking forward to meet you, indeed, hopefully very soon in person.
Indeed, thank you ever so much, Peter. I think that was a very good summary. Well done. I think you did that in about 3 or 4 minutes as well, so very well done there. Well, I think that's it in terms of the sort of main content of the conference. I mean, as I mentioned at the start, thank you very much to everyone who's participated, both the speakers, presenters, and everybody who's participated through the chat function as well. I think that's been really great. And I can't see the detailed chat that's taking place in this session, but I guess hopefully there is some general feedback comments of how other people have found the session. So I look forward to seeing those later. But certainly I know from everybody I've spoken to has felt the conference has gone very well. So thank you very much to Dan and the team for all your hard work and making these virtual conferences such a success. And I think even if we're moving back to the physical world, I think you've become the star act in these virtual conferences. So I guess you'll keep that going a little bit as well. Over to you, and thank you very much to everyone again.
Amit, thank you. Thank you for those very kind words. Thank you so much. And Peter, thank you for summarizing those 3 days of discussions in such a nice way as well. And that was a perfect way to wrap things up. And of course, to all of our stakeholders for their final comments there. Really appreciate it. I think it's great to have that opportunity to hear what everyone thinks, the final takeaways. And I think it's always a good sign when there's such a wide range of different takeaways, and it really shows the range of different topics that we covered. And yeah, it's nice that everyone takes something different from the event, which is great. And Amit's mentioned about in the chat and wants to hear from you, and I can see that some of you have already put comments and things into the chat. So please do continue with that. We want to hear your thoughts, so please do put those into the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. But Amit, Peter, thank you both so much for that, and that's really appreciated. So we're almost done, but as I said, we now want to hear from you on your thoughts on and whether you agree or disagree with the comments that have been made from our stakeholders there. But before we do, if you don't mind bearing me just for a couple of seconds, I want to just end with the final few event thank yous. So first of all, I wanted to again thank Jean-Pierre and EWIA for hosting this reception. Once again, it really is appreciated, Jean-Pierre, and as I said, let's all hope that we can meet up in person, and you can maybe take again the traditional role that's now been brought by EWIA of hosting the event in person. So thank you very much for that, and let's all hope for that next year. Thank you again to all of our sponsors and partners as well. We really appreciate the support of all of the sponsors and partners. You can see the logos on the screen, on the banner, I should say, just behind me. But thank you all so much for that. Without the support of our sponsors and partners, this event wouldn't be possible. So we really do appreciate everything that you do to make this possible. A huge thank you to all of our speakers, panelists, and moderators across the 9 plenary sessions and the 9 showcase sessions that have taken place over the 3 days of discussions that we've had. We've had some hugely interesting and some wide-ranging debates, and we really appreciate all of your involvement and the time and your thoughts. both at the event itself, but also in the build-up. I mean, I think one of the things about the virtual events is there's a lot more kind of tech tests and things in the build-up, so it is more time-consuming for all of our speakers and moderators to take part in those before the event day itself. So thank you all. We do really appreciate that, and I'm pleased to say that pretty much everything seems to have run pretty smoothly. So all those tech tests were worth it. So thank you all very much. A big thank you as well to all of you out there. So all of you who participated at the event, both via the event platform itself, and also those of you who've been watching and are still watching via our live feeds on Twitter and YouTube. We've just been looking at the numbers of attendees at the event, and we've had over 1,200 people participating on the platform itself here. And about another 600 or so via Twitter. So we're getting close to almost 2,000 people altogether participating at the conference, which is absolutely fantastic. So we really do appreciate all of your time and the way that all of you have got involved, and particularly to those of you who have actively participated in the discussions via the chat and also on our audience polls. We will be publishing the results of the polls after the event, probably on the event website, to kind of make those public. But yeah, it's really appreciated, and I think the involvement that all of you have made is a massive part of the success of the event and the interactive nature of the session. So thank you all very much for that. And finally, as ever, I wanted to save the final thank you to my fantastic colleagues in the Spectrum team here at Forum Europe. So to James, Kate, Jordan, and Lula. Once again, guys, the job that you've done on this event has been unbelievable. And I think I've said before, but to say again, I really couldn't hope for a better team to work with. So guys, thank you all so much. The amount of work that's been put in is incredible. So it really, really is appreciated. So thank you. And just before we finish with the more formal part of the session and move to our musical entertainment, I wanted to finally give a quick plug for our next series of 5G and Spectrum-related events, and that's our WRC23 webinars. So we're going to be running a series of 3 standalone events taking place in March and April, and each event is going to be focusing on one of the key issues that have been set to be discussed at WRC23. So we have a webinar focusing on the UHF band, a webinar focusing on the 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz band, and a webinar on the 6 gigahertz band. Obviously, all issues that are focused quite heavily, particularly in the discussions today, and it'll be great to have an opportunity to focus in more detail on those events at the webinars there. So you can find more information about these events and also our upcoming Global Spectrum Series conferences via the website for the series, which is www.spectrum-series.com. So we've heard the conclusions from some of our event speakers, and now it's over to all of you out there. As I say, we're really keen to hear from you on what your key takeaways and conclusions are from the last 3 days of discussions that we have had, and we invite you to add these in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And whilst you're doing that, we're delighted to have some guests joining us to provide us with some entertainment. So I'm delighted to now welcome to the stage now the SweetBeats. That's Claire, Daryl, and Will, who are with us to play some tunes and to help us close the event. So hi guys, welcome, and it's great to have you all here. So that's just about it. Thank you all so much once again for your participation over the past week. We really do appreciate all of you getting involved and joining us for the various sessions that we have had. So please do now stay. Let us know what your key takeaways are from the discussion, and most important, pour yourself a drink and enjoy the music. Thank you again, everyone. Claire, Daryl, Will, over to you.
Hello, the SweetBeats. Thank you so much for having us. As Dan says, make sure you got a drink ready, and we hope you enjoy our music. There's a fire starting in my heart, reaching a fever pitch, and it's bringing me out the dark. Finally, I can see you crystal clear. Go ahead and sell me out, and I'll lay your wish bare. See how I leave with every piece of you. Don't underestimate the things that I will do. There's a fire starting in my heart, reaching a fever pitch, and it's bringing me out the dark. The scars of your love remind me of us. They keep me thinking that we almost had it all. The scars of your love, they leave me breathless. I can't help thinking we could have had it all. no story to be told. But I'll put one on you and I'm gonna let your head burn. Think of me in the depths of your despair. Make a home down there, cause mine sure won't be shared. The scars of your love that leave me breathless. I can't help thinking that we almost had it all. The scars of your love that leave me breathless. I can't help thinking we could have had it all. Rolling in the deep, you have my heart inside of your hand. Then you faded to the beat. We could have had it all. Rolling in the deep, you have my heart inside of your hand. Then you played it to the beat. Throw your soul through every open door. Know your blessings to find what you look for. Turn my sorrow into treasured gold. You pay me back in kind and reap just what you sow. We could have had it all. We could have had it all. It all, it all, it all. We could have had it all. Rolling in the deep, you have my heart inside of your hand. Then you played it to the beat. We could have had it all. Rolling in the deep, you have my heart inside of your hand. Then you played it, you played it, you played it, played it to the beat. Captured effortlessly, that's the way it was. Happened so naturally, I did not know it was love. First thing I felt was you holding me close. What was I gonna do? I let myself go, and now we're flying through the sky. So this night will last forever. I've been waiting for you, it's been so long. I knew just what I would do when I heard your song. You filled my heart with a kiss, you gave me freedom. I knew I could not resist, I needed someone. And now we're flying through the skies, hope this night will last forever. Oh, 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 ain't nobody loves me better, makes me happy, makes me feel this way. Ain't nobody loves me better than you. I've been waiting for you, it's been so long. I knew just what I would do when I heard your song. You filled my heart with a kiss, you gave me freedom. I knew I could not resist, I needed someone. And now we're flying through the skies, hope this night will last forever. Oh, 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 ain't nobody loves me better, makes me happy, makes me feel this way. Ain't nobody loves me better, makes me happy, makes me feel this way. First you put your arms around me, and then you put your charms around me. We stare into each other's eyes, and what we see is no surprise. At first you put your arms around me, and then you put your charms around me. Got a feeling most with treasure, and a love so deep we cannot measure. Ain't nobody loves me better, makes me happy, makes me feel this way. Ain't nobody loves me better, makes me happy, makes me feel this way. Ain't nobody loves me better, makes me happy, makes me feel this way. Ain't nobody loves me better, makes me happy, makes me feel this way. Woo! Yeah. We're 1,000 miles from comfort. We have traveled land and sea. But as long as you are with me, there's no place I'd rather be. I will wait forever, exalted in the sea. But as long as we're together, there's no place I'd rather be. With every step we take, Kyoto to the bay, strolling so casually. We're different and the same, gave you another name, switch up the battery. If you gave me a chance, I would take it. It's a shot in the dark, but I'll make it. No, with all of your heart, you can't shame me. When I am with you, there's no place I'd rather be. No, 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 no. No place I'd rather be. No, 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 no. No place I'd rather be. No, 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 no. No place I'd rather be. We set out on a mission to find our inner peace, make it everlasting, so nothing's incomplete. It's easy being with you, sacred simplicity. As long as we're together, there's no place I'd rather be. With every step we take, Kyoto to the bay, strolling so casually. We're different and the same, gave you another name, switch up the battery. If you gave me a chance, I would take it. It's a shot in the dark, but I'll make it. No, with all of your heart, you can't shame me. When I am with you, there's no place I'd rather be. No, 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 no place I'd rather be. No, 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 no place I'd rather be. No, 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 no place I'd rather be. When I am with you, there's no place I'd rather be. Be, 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 be. Yeah, 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 yeah. If you gave me a chance, I would take it. It's a shot in the dark, but I'll make it. No, with all of your heart, you can can't shame me. When I am with you, there's no place I'd rather be. No, 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 no. No place I'd rather be. No, 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 no. No place I'd rather be. No, 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 no. No place I'd rather be. When I am with you, there's no place I'd rather be. No, 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 no. No place I'd rather be. No, 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 no. No place I'd rather be. No, 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 no. No place I'd rather be. When I am with you, there's no place I'd rather be. Yeah. Perhaps maybe at the pub. Nice. Sometime soon. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love you, but I've got to stay true. My morals got me on my knees. I'm begging you, please stop playing games. I don't know what this is, but you got me good, just like I knew you would. I don't know what you do, but you do it well. I'm under your spell. You got me begging you for mercy. Why won't you release me? You got me begging you for mercy. Why won't you release me? Why won't you release me? Now you think that I will be stomping on the side, but you got to understand that I need a man who can take my hand. Yes, I do. I don't know what this is, but you got me good, just like I knew you would. I don't know what you do, but you do it well. I'm under your spell. You got me begging you for mercy. Why won't you release me? You got me begging you for mercy. Why won't you release me? Why won't you release me? Bring down, I'm begging you for mercy. Just why won't you release me? I'm begging you for mercy. Now you got me begging, yeah, you got me begging, yeah, you got me begging. Mercy, why won't you release me? You got me begging you for mercy. Why won't you release me? Why won't you release me? Yeah, yeah. Mercy, why won't you release me? You got me begging you for mercy. Why won't you release me? Why won't you release me? Yeah. Right, so sadly, this next one is the last song. So if you haven't already managed to, you think you better have a bit of a boogie, whether you manage to stand up or stay sitting in your seats, that's fine too. And we're looking forward to, hopefully, when the world gets back to normal, we can hopefully see you in real life at a gig. So we'd love to see you. So check us out, the SweetBeats. Check us out. And we hope you enjoy the last song. Thank you. attention, baby. I gotta tell you a little something about yourself. You're wonderful, flawless, ooh, you're a sexy lady. But you walk around here like you wanna be someone else. Oh, oh, I know that you don't know it, but you're fine, so fine. Oh, 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 girl, I'm gonna show you when you're mine, oh, mine. Treasure, that is what you are. Honey, you're my golden star. I know you can make my wish come true if you let me treasure you. If you let me treasure you. Pretty girl, pretty girl, pretty girl, you should be smiling. A girl like you should never look so blue. You're everything I see in my dreams. I wouldn't say it to you if it wasn't true. Oh, oh, I know that you don't know it, but you're fine, so fine. Oh, 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 girl, I'm gonna show you when you're mine, oh, mine. Treasure, that is what you are. Honey, you're my golden star. I know you can make my wish come true if you let me treasure you. If you let me treasure you. You are my treasure. You are my treasure. You are my treasure. Yeah, you are my treasure. You are my treasure. You are my treasure. Yeah, you are treasure. That is what you are. Honey, you're my golden star. I know you can make my wish come true if you let me treasure you. If you let me treasure you. Thank you very much. Take care. Stay safe.